Hellenic History by George Willis Botsford. Chapter 1. Country and People. In the history of the Greeks the centre of interest lies, not in their peninsula, but in the coasts and islands of the Aegean Sea, which collectively formed the very heart of Hellas. It was not till they had passed the zenith of their development that the interior and north of the mainland came into prominence. For their beginnings it is instructive to take note of their situation in the great cultural area which borders the eastern half of the Mediterranean Sea. In this area mankind first emerged from barbarism. It is a region which at the dawn of history was especially subject to immigration. We may infer then that from concentration added to natural growth, the population became too dense to find support in hunting, fishing and gathering wild fruits and nuts. The productive valleys of the Nile and the Euphrates, and to a less degree the small alluvial plains at the mouths of the rivers on both Aegean coasts, invited to agriculture. From tilling the soil, however rudely, to the higher stages of civilization, the way was comparatively easy. This development was favoured by the mild subtropical climate, less enervating than the equatorial heat. It yet rendered life far easier than is possible in the temperate zones. On the Mediterranean shores men need less food, clothing and shelter. They live more in the open air, in social contact with one another. Thus their struggle for existence is not all-absorbing. They have more leisure to devote to thought and to the creation of the adornments of life, and more opportunity for discussion, for the interchange and clarification of ideas. Communication between the Aegean region and the Orient was easy. The ships of Crete sailed south but a short way to Libya, and thence crept along the coast to the delta. The Aegean shores are lined with harbours well adapted to the small vessels of early time. In fact, the sea between these coasts is itself, so to speak, a great harbour opening to the Orient. These conditions brought southeastern Europe and the adjacent Anatolian coast into closest historical relations with the East. Broadly then, the Aegean region was one with the great valleys of the Nile and Euphrates. All were included in the home of the oldest civilization. Within this wide area, however, were striking contrasts of geography, hints of historical growth. The Aegean region, on the highway of migration and traffic between two continents, attracted strangers of diverse race and genius, and these immigrant particularities combined to make the Greeks extremely versatile. The interaction, too, of strangers upon one another, their rivalries and efforts at mutual adjustment, provided a most powerful stimulus to progress. In Babylonia, on the other hand, this force was less operative, while in Egypt it existed only at certain crises. Great political contrasts, too, arose. The necessity of regulating the waters of the Nile and Euphrates called into existence vast systems of cooperative labour enforced by an absolute king, whereas in the Aegean world the division of the country into little islands, or on the mainlands diminutive plains separated by high mountain ranges, encouraged the grouping of the population in small independent communities. The conditions of life within these little states, together with the reciprocal relations among them, contributed enormously to the development of individuality and intelligence. The genius of the people in these directions was further determined by the mountainous character of their country. In this rugged environment a man could readily make a living for himself and his family in independence, by hunting birds and beasts, pasturing a few domestic animals, and tilling a small patch of ground. He had little need of neighbours, still less of kings. His courage he exercised in battle with the wild boar, the bear, leopard and lion. Against any force likely to menace his home he could depend on his strong arm, or at the worst on flight to some hidden or guarded refuge. Hence arose his fearlessness, the foundation of his character. On the sole basis of courage rested liberty to do and think. On liberty rested intelligence and individuality. In a large degree, too, the nature of the people was determined by the products of their country. Although Greece could never compare in fertility with Central Europe, England, or America, it was far more productive anciently than now. There was then a smaller area of bare rock. The soil was thicker, richer, and better supplied with moisture. Yet even in earliest times it was but a lean country with its thin flesh barely covering the bones which here and there protruded nakedly. High mountain tops were crowned with bald rocks, bordered with a fringe of alpine plants. Below the snow line grew forests of pine, fir, cedar, oaks of several kinds, beech, bay, and some wild fruits, as the apple, pear, and grapes. The plane and cypress are thought to be importations, and the chestnut, walnut, and almond do not appear till late in history. The thin woods permitted the growth of brush and grass, which pastured domestic animals. The mountaineer gave his chief attention to rearing pigs, fattening them on the abundant acorns which afforded too a substantial element of the family diet. On the mountain side below the forest zone lay the drier, thinner soiled scrubland, covered with the anemone, asphodel, hyacinth, myrtle, juniper, and other plants. There was a lack of berries, but the many flowers gave food to bees that supplied the inhabitants with their sole material sweetness. Over this zone of scrub ruled the shepherds, with their herds of sheep and goats that perpetually nibbled their dry, prickly food and furnished the more refined people of the villages with leather, wool, milk, and meat. For the protection of their flocks and pasture rights, the shepherds became warlords, each surrounded by an army of savage dogs. The winter cold drove them to encroach on the neighbouring plains, where often, on questions of trespass and damage, they waged battle with the tillers of the soil. These plains lay either wholly surrounded by mountains or between mountain range and sea. Here the soil, none too good, produced wheat when at its best, otherwise barley, spelt, and millet. Among the vegetables were peas, beans, onions, leeks, and garlic. The fruits were apples, pears, quinces, pomegranates, figs, grapes, and chief of all, olives. The date palm grew in southern Peloponnese and the neighbouring islands. Olive oil was used for food, for anointing the body, and for burning in lamps. Flax provided oil and linen. In addition to fowls and the smaller domestic animals, the farmers reared donkeys, mules, and occasionally cows. There were few horses except in Boeotia and Thessaly, and everywhere they were the ornament of luxurious wealth, used by the cavalry in war and in time of peace for riding and driving, but never as beasts of burden. Summarily, the animal and vegetable products, far from effecting a surplus of riches, were too scant to support meagrely a moderately dense population. If a leisurely class was to exist and a high degree of refinement to be attained, the Greeks would have to find other sources of wealth. Turning from farming and grazing to minerals, we discover an almost equal lack of resources. Euboea produced copper, though not nearly enough to supply the demand, and for tin, a necessary ingredient, of much used bronze. The Greeks had to depend wholly on importations. It was not till near the end of the second millennium BC that they began to use iron in the industries. They found it in Euboea and the island of Seriphus, and far more abundantly in the mountain range of Taygetus, Laconia. In spite of this restricted mining area, the yield allowed a surplus for export. Of the two precious metals, gold must have been relatively abundant and easily obtained in the Minoan age, though we do not know where was the source of supply. In the historical period it was found in the islands of Cyphus and Thasos, and the opposite Thracian coast. Doubtless, however, some of the gold used by the Greeks came from foreign lands. Silver was mined along with the gold, and in Attica, Laurium produced it with lead. In building stone alone is all Greece rich, and the best of marbles come from Mount Pentelicus in Attica and the island of Paris. In the 4th century the Athenians began to derive profit from its exportation. Last but not least in importance were the clay fields distributed over all Greece, which made possible the potter's trade. No coal was mined, and even now within the Mediterranean basin little has been found, and that of inferior quality. Wood and charcoal supplied the heat necessary for cooking and the industries. The natural economic resources, however varied, were all limited in quantity. A Greek therefore had to make the best use of his scant means to study economy. Next to fearlessness and love of liberty, moderation was the greatest quality of the race. This principle holds not only for eating, drinking, shelter, and the other material things of life, but equally for literature and the fine arts. The simple self-restraint of Hellenism, the product of a long, severe training, contrasts with the redundance of means employed by all other European artists, ancient and modern. Another feature of Greece which bore powerfully on character is to be sought in the lack of unity between coast and interior. We have seen that the nature of the country, its division by waters and by high mountain ranges into islands and little plains, prevented the inhabitants from massing together in large social and political groups. Exploitation of the interior and the north, which formed their back country, would have demanded a united effort, like that which brought the North American colonies under a single government. But this region was crowded with mountains, inaccessible and repellent, which forced the plain and coast people to the sea as their sphere of life, to colonization and commerce. This course of action still further stimulated their intelligence and enterprise, but tended even more to decentralization. Whereas great continental undertakings call for unity, a single city, whether Athens or Venice, has found it easier, unhampered by political dependence, to create a great naval power and an extensive commerce. The factors that mould character thus far considered are in whole or part economic. It is possible, however, to find in the country physical features which act directly on the mind. First of all is the endless variety, contrasting with the monotony of Egypt, the ever-changing landscapes which made for versatility. Whereas the Egyptians seem to us like so many slices from the same cheese, we find among the ancient Greeks as great differences among civilized men of the whole world today. There was no typical Greek. The landscapes too are always suggestive. Beyond the nearer range is another higher, and the one still further away presents an opening through which are revealed more distant heights. Thus the imagination is tempted forth beyond its immediate surroundings to embark on voyages of mental exploration. The beauty it meets on the way is not sensuous, inviting to eat, drink, and sleep. Rather it is intellectual, appealing to the noblest faculties of man. These naked, jagged mountain heights, be it noticed, have no economic value. They do their part in awakening a love of beauty for its own sake, which has created for all time the absolute ideal of art. Akin is the love of truth for its own sake, that noble intellectual ideal, unmastered by thought of worldly gain, which made the Greeks the discoverers of the principles of knowledge, the creators of science and philosophy. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2. The Minoan Age. Neolithic Age to 3000 BC. Our earliest glimpse of the Aegean area reveals a people in possession of the Neolithic culture. As yet they were ignorant of the metals, but had learned to polish their stone implements with a view to increasing the cutting power. A good opportunity for the study of progress during the Neolithic Age is afforded by Knossos, Crete. The deposits left by the people of this culture on the site of the palace there, measuring in places 20 feet in depth, were doubtless accumulating through several thousand years. During this long age we can trace the slow evolution of mankind by the fragments of pottery which still survive. In the lowest stratum they are of crude clay, roughly fashioned by hand. Gradually the potter learned to purify his material, to mold it in somewhat more pleasing forms, and to fire it in an oven. Meanwhile he was making the earliest attempts at ornamentation. The first step was to scratch the surface with angular lines, whence developed the style described as geometric. The next was to fill the incisions with a white chalky substance, the beginning of vase painting. Other varieties of Neolithic earthenware need not be considered here. Neolithic life. From material found at Knossos and in deposits of the same age elsewhere, we learn that the people of the time used stone axes, hammers, and knives, besides many utensils of bone and horn. Undoubtedly, their chief material for weapons and implements was wood, all of which, however, has perished. At first they clothed themselves in skins, and this material continued down into historical Greece in the dress of the country folk. But before the end of the age, the chiefs and their families were in a position to array themselves in woven garments, a waistcloth for men and a skirt for women. In earlier times they lived in round, rarely oval huts of wattle daubed with clay. Only in course of centuries and in favorable conditions did the abode become a rectangle divided into several rooms and protected with walls of small, rough stones. In their light boats they rowed freely from isle to isle to exchange their simple wares. The occurrence of a similar style of pottery, not only over the Aegean Isles, but as far distant as Cyprus and Egypt, proves the existence of commerce throughout this extended area. It is the connection with Egypt, whose chronology in broad outline is known even for this remote time, which enables us to fix the date for the close of the Neolithic Age at about 3000, Minoan Age 3000 to 1200. The Bronze, or more strictly Copper-Bronze Age, which developed from the Neolithic, is now widely known as Minoan, after Minos, a legendary king, or perhaps a god of Crete. Dr. Evans, the explorer of Knossos, divides the Minoan Age into three periods: early, middle, and late. In the present volume, the term Mycenaean will be treated as equivalent to late Minoan. Early Minoan, Copper Age, 3000 to 2200. In the beginning of the early Minoan Age, the potter invented a black glaze for washing his wares. On the lustrous surface thus produced, he painted white bands in white or rarely red. Sometimes he left to the surface its natural buff, whereon he placed black glaze stripes. These elements of art continued down to historical Greece. Gradually, the molding and painting attained freedom and variety. As the pointed instruments yielded to the brush, zigzags naturally developed into curvilinear and simple spiral designs. Here, too, appears the first evidence of the potter's wheel. Slowly followed the effort to express the forms of living things, all in geometric style. The human body was represented by two triangles, the points coming together at the girdle. The legs and arms were little more than lines. Equally crude are the statuettes, presumably idols of the same age. In the carving of stone vessels, however, the artist reached perfection. Melos. A leading center of culture in this period was the island of Melos. Here were quarries of obsidian, a hard volcanic rock, which splits readily into thin blades, and was therefore especially serviceable for knives, razors, and all sharp-bladed or sharp-pointed instruments. By exporting wares of this kind in great quantities to neighboring lands, the Melians grew relatively prosperous. Hence, they were able to make progress in the comforts of life. Next, after them, followed the inhabitants of the neighboring Cyclades, and in fact their influence was felt from the coast of Argolis, Greece, to Troy in Asia Minor. Dwellings and tombs. In this period, the rectangular house became larger, more substantial and better furnished. Many a chieftain must have had his palace, but the one at Troy is best known to us. This site had been occupied in the transition to the Bronze Age, and the settlement of which now speak is the second. The essential element of the palace is a great hall, megaron, with a central hearth. From this room we pass through a door into a vestibule, formed by the projecting walls, and from there into a large open court. This type of dwelling originated in Central Europe. The same plan is afterward found, on a more complex scale, in the palace at Tiryns. In exposed places, from the beginning of the age, men were wont to fortify their settlements with rude walls of uncut stones, whereas other cities, like those of Crete, remained unprotected. Copper, pictographs. The great innovation of the age was the introduction of copper, most probably from Egypt and Cyprus. It was used for tools and weapons. Silver and gold became known in the same period. Copper was followed at an interval of centuries by bronze. For a long time, however, stone maintained its place in the useful arts. Equally important was the adoption of a system of picture writing, pictographs. They were found in Crete on seals of ivory, stone, and other material in the form of cylinders, buttons, and prisms. Their near resemblance to Egyptian types proves an intercourse between these two countries in the age of their production. Other wares were exchanged in this period, and the Egyptian records mention the Aegean folk by name. It is this commerce which enables us to set the closing date of the early Minoan age at about 2200. Area of the culture. In this period, the Aegean civilization extended from the Cyclades to Troy and Cyprus, and in the opposite direction to the coasts of Greece. There were many local varieties of culture. Although early in the age Troy and the Cyclades had the lead, Trojan progress was checked by the destruction of the city, whereas the islands continued their advance. In Crete, the eastern towns were the most progressive. Meanwhile, the Aegean folk were carrying their products to Egypt, as stated above, and in other directions to the valley of the Danube and to Sicily and southern Italy. Middle Minoan, First Bronze Age, 2200 to 1600. Toward the close of the third millennium BC, Central Crete came decidedly to the front. This change marks the beginning of the Middle Minoan period. The chief seats of culture were Knossos and Festus. Near Festus, the modern village of Hagia Triada marks a third important site. The east was occupied by lesser cities, whereas in the west of the island no remains of the age have as yet been unearthed. The Minoan civilization now entered upon its most brilliant period. The invention of the wheel enabled the potter to develop his trade into a fine art. The most beautiful specimens are of the Camares type, so named after the cave on Mount Ida, where they were first discovered. The clay, reduced to the utmost purity, was molded in artistic forms. In the eggshell thinness of their walls, they may be compared with the best Haviland china of today. The painted designs on them are in various shades of white, orange, crimson, and yellow, developing from the two main color classes of the preceding age. The aim was not the representation of nature, but the creation of a brilliant harmony of colors. In time, however, the polychrome ornamentation gave way to the simpler principles of the earlier age, while there developed a close imitation of natural objects. Equally naturalistic are the patterns in faience, for which the close of the Middle Minoan period is famous. Places, writing. Early in the age, the kings of Knossos and Festus built great palaces. After 2 or 3 centuries they were destroyed or fell to ruin, whereupon the kings proceeded to erect new dwellings on a grander scale. The interior walls they decorated with frescoes from human life and nature. Within the Cnossian palace, the art of writing reached the high stage of development. From the original pictographs arose a linear script, in which some characters are doubtless ideographs, denoting things rather than sounds or groups of sounds, whereas others seem to represent syllables. Royal archives of clay tablets indicate its use for governmental business. The old system of writing continued by the side of the new. In the deposits which close the age, the excavator of Festus found a clay disc, covered on both sides with pictographs, evidently stamped on the clay while still soft, and representing therefore the first known printing with movable types. As the characters are quite different from the Minoan, the disc evidently came from some outlying region, perhaps Asia Minor. Late Minoan, Mycenaean age, 1600 to 1200. In the beginning of the late Minoan age, Cretan civilization, having achieved its utmost, began to stagnate. It no longer created new forms, but merely repeated stereotyped conventions. For a time, however, we find a political advance. Knossos and Festus still flourished, while other cities declined and disappeared. It would perhaps accord best with the facts to suppose that the king of Knossos now ruled the whole island and made use of Festus as a secondary capital. The Cnossian palace attained to the acme of its grandeur about 1500. To this period belong most of the mural frescoes, still preserved. In vase ornamentation, the characteristic development was the palace style, which sacrificed the natural to a desire for decorative unity. The age attained great skill in bronze work, and in inlaying metals with other substances. In writing, linear script superseded the pictographs, and a new and improved linear style developed from the old. Throughout the early and middle Minoan ages, the Greek peninsula lagged far behind the Aegean Isles in culture. During nearly all this time, Thessaly and Boeotia remained Neolithic, and farther south the peninsula made but little progress beyond this condition. A great change came with the beginning of the late Minoan time. In fact, this age had not advanced far when the leadership in culture shifted to Troy, and still more to Greece, where Terence, Mycenae, and Orchomenus were entering upon an era of artistic and political splendor. Life in Crete and Mycenae, 2000 to 1400. The abundance of material that reached us from the Middle Minoan and early Mycenaean ages affords a clear and comprehensive view of the life of those times. The dominant racial type was a long skull, oval face, brown complexion, black hair, and short stature. The physique of the South Italian or Sicilian of today. These people were thin and wiry, with wasp waists, lively in action, dependent on agility rather than bulk, a keenly competitive folk, gifted with a delicate aesthetic taste and an intuitive mind. Dress. Usually a man wore simply a cloth fastened at the girdle and covering the hips. Sometimes the dress was so modified as to form short trousers. With a close-fitting belt, he accentuated the smallness of his waist. The priestly and holiday attire was an ample cloak, which reached from neck to ankles. The Cretan's black hair fell over his shoulders in long curls. His face was beardless, whereas at Mycenae it was fashionable to allow the free growth of whiskers. The woman wore a low bodice and a bell-shaped skirt abundantly adorned with ruffles or flounces. Favorite colors were yellow, purple, and blue. Her black hair she dressed elaborately in twists and curls, while the whiteness of her face she intensified by artificial means. She either left her head bare or surmounted it with a hat, some of whose designs closely resemble those of today. In addition to these essentials of dress, she profusely adorned herself with jewels of gold and precious stones. Altogether, her attire was extremely conventional and modish. Her pictures in ancient art find their counterpart in modern fashion plates. The footgear of both sexes was elaborated with embroidery and delicate colored bindings. Dwellings. Like the feminine garb of the age, the private dwellings of the wealthy were surprisingly modern. They were built on no fixed plan, but followed the necessities of the site and the taste of the owner. They were of stone, wood, or brick, and their windows seem to have been protected by oiled and tinted parchment. Some were 3 or 4 stories high, and comprised a multitude of rooms. The owners furnished them comfortably and developed cooking to a high degree of perfection. Palace. Naturally, the palace was incomparably larger and more magnificent than the richest private dwelling. The residence of the king of Knossos occupied more than 5 acres and stood at least 4 stories high. Its irregularity of plan may be due to additions and modifications by successive rulers. The essential feature of any large Cretan dwelling, private or royal, is the grouping of rooms about a court. The Cnossian palace comprised an immense central court, smaller courts, long corridors, a theatral space, audience rooms, sanctuaries, an industrial quarter, and a system of drainage not equalled in Europe between that day and the 19th century. We may notice more particularly the room in which the throne of gypsum stands against the wall, and is flanked on both sides with long benches of the same material. Here, in the midst of his noble councillors, sat the king on the oldest throne in Europe, presumably to receive embassies and to transact business with his subjects. The industrial quarter swarmed with artists and artisans, whose labors extended over a wide range of activities, from the preparation and storage of wine and olive oil in huge earthenware jars, to the finest goldwork and elaborate mural frescoes. One chamber, fitted up with benches and a seat for the master, is thought to be a schoolroom, in which the young learned to mold clay into little tablets and inscribe them with linear writing. Elsewhere were the archives in which these tablets were stored by the thousands. Although the script has not yet been deciphered, the inscriptions thus far discovered seem to be accounts of stores and of receipts and dues. A larger tablet from the Dictaean cave has the appearance of a list of offerings. If the Cretans possessed a literature of songs, epics, and chronicles, as is not unlikely, it must have been written on perishable material, for nothing of the kind has been discovered. It is known, however, that they had the decimal notation and perhaps as many as 4 systems of weights, including the 2 most used in historical Greece. By dropping a definite weight of silver or gold upon a striated surface, they took the first step in the coinage of these metals. Bronze ingots, too, of definite weight were stamped that they might serve as currency. Workmen and their products. Many laborers busied themselves with tilling the soil and with rearing cattle, sheep, goats, and swine. They ground their barley or wheat in querns, or crushed it in stone mortars still preserved. Among their fruits were the fig and the olive, whose oil entered into the preparation of food. Trades were specialized, as in the Orient. Among the craftsmen were potters, brickmakers, and carpenters, whose bronze saws, axes, files, and other tools resemble in pattern those of today. Naturally, in an age of bronze, the workers in that metal filled a large place. Stone, while still serving the lesser arts, had become the essential of architecture, and throughout all history wood has furnished a convenient material for building and for a great variety of furniture. Among the most remarkable of skilled industries was the cutting and engraving of precious stones, which included practically all known to the moderns except the diamond. On these gems the engraver skillfully wrought varied scenes from nature and human life. The highest development of art is found in the work of the goldsmith, an achievement of the painstaking experience of centuries. This metal was then more common than silver. Among his products were beads adorned with scenes in intaglio, and rings with similarly decorated bezels, used as seals. He could inlay gold, as well as ivory and other material, on bodies of different substance, so as to produce a polychrome effect. He wrought bracelets, diverse artistic patterns, in repoussé on thin plate, and graceful drinking cups. Famed for beauty are the 2 gold cups from a beehive tomb at Vaphio, Laconia. The scenes which adorn them are bold, spirited, and lifelike. Warfare. In war the rank and file were without defensive armor, and carried the sling and bow. In the latter art the Cretans were especially strong, as we infer from the magazine of bronze arrowheads in the Cnosian palace. In fact, throughout ancient history they kept the lead in archery. A warrior of the better class protected himself with a huge shield, which reached from neck to ankles. It was made of leather stretched on a wooden frame, in form of semi-cylinder or an oval with notched sides. A helmet and greaves completed the defensive armor, whereas he assailed his foe with a short dagger, a sword for thrusting, and a lance, the metal parts of bronze. Unable to carry far the great weight of the shield, he rode to battle in a 2-wheeled chariot drawn by a pair of horses. With him as charioteer rode his squire, who sometimes carried a sword. Using his chariot merely for conveyance, the warrior descended in battle to engage in close combat with his foe. Not only many weapons have survived, but also pictures of military life. We see warriors engaged in hand-to-hand combat, while fragments of a silver vase present a living view of a siege. On the large piece illustrated in the text, we see outside the walls slingers and bowmen in action. Behind them stand two men, probably elders, like those described by Hesiod, on the shield of Heracles, 246 f. To the blessed gods, their hands uplifted for their fighting sons. On the tower above, excited women shriek. Smaller fragments show fallen warriors outstretched, others carrying the dead, and others hurling lances. City walls. The Cretan cities were unwalled. As a defense against strangers, they had their navy, and like the later Spartans, they must have reposed confidence in their bulwarks of brave warriors. In more exposed positions, however, as at Troy, men were accustomed from the beginning of the Minoan age to protect their settlements with walls. Gradually, the crude wall of unshaped stones was superseded by massive masonry, such as we find at Tiryns. There, the defenses are of huge, slightly dressed stones, arranged roughly in layers and held together by mortar. The interstices are filled with smaller stones. This is the so-called Cyclopean masonry. Originally, the Tyrrhenian wall must have risen to a height of 60 feet, the upper part of brick. In the present ruins, on the south and southeast, are two great galleries, covered by a pointed arch, formed by the gradual overlapping of successive layers of stone. This mode of forming arches and domes is characteristic of the age. Connected with the southeast gallery is a series of chambers. Undoubtedly, in these well-protected spaces, provisions and war material were stored against a siege. At Mycenae we find more advanced masonry. In one kind, termed ashlar, the stones are cut in oblong shape and arranged in horizontal layers. Still more developed is the polygonal style, composed of large many-faced stones so carefully fitted as to leave no space for rubble. The cruder forms continued by the side of the more highly developed. Religion. Deities. The chief deity was a nature power, the mother of all living things. Rhea in Crete, Cybele in Asia Minor. As patroness of field and mountain, she stands conspicuous on a lofty rock between her two attendant lions. In her relation with civilized life, she arms herself with a double axe to battle for her city, or in times of quiet presides over multifarious social and political functions. Her son, the youthful Zeus, a god who is born and ultimately dies, likewise wields the battle axe, or, when duly invoked by the young men, curates, in martial dance, vouchsafes full jars, fleecy flocks, prosperous sea-borne ships, and goodly law. Another great deity was possibly Minos, worshipped in the form of a bull. Among the deities of less prominence we recognize Aphrodite, a nude or lightly clad idol, her hands brought together on her breast, sometimes accompanied by doves, and Artemis, deity of wood and animals, of hunting and fishing. The serpent attributes of another goddess connect her with the earth or underworld, with the spirits of the tomb or of the house. Throughout the age were fashioned small images of these gods, and of others whose character eludes our study. In addition to divinities in human form, they adored or venerated as sacred symbols, trees, pillars, the cross, the double axe, and various other objects. They built no temples, but conducted their worship in the open air, in caves or in chapels within their dwellings. Worship of the dead. Another aspect of religion was the worship of the dead, which included the customs of burial. A type of inhumation is represented in the circular cemetery on the Acropolis of Mycenae. The 6 graves found here were the burial place of a long dynasty, who used it for all the members of their family, men, women, and children. Each contained several bodies. In death they were elegantly apparelled, and loaded with jewels and gold ornaments. With them further were buried articles of toilet, cooking utensils, and table furniture, tools, military equipment, in brief, everything civilized men and women needed in daily life. A gold mask found in one tomb undoubtedly imitated the face of the living. They covered the grave with stone slabs and mounded it over, reopening it for new burials. To the dead they offered sacrifices of wild and domestic animals, probably also of human beings, as the scattered bones of men and animals suggest. Evidently the Minoans believed that the spirits of the dead lived in the tombs and enjoyed these sacrifices and this rich equipment. In submitting to such expensive services, the living must have been actuated not only by respect for the dead, but by a superstitious dread of ghosts, who, when neglected, forsook their abode to do mischief to their kinsfolk. Beehive tombs. Later kings of vastly greater power built in their lower city their dome-shaped beehive tombs. The masonry is ashlar. The stones are smoothed and fitted together with nice precision. The entire structure is underground, approached from the side of the hill by a long horizontal passage. The largest building of this class at Mycenae has been popularly known as the Treasury of Atreus, more recently as the Tomb of Atreus, father of Agamemnon. Its corridor of approach is 115 feet in length, the dome 48 feet high and the same in diameter. The kings who erected these immense, lasting structures, like the Egyptian pyramid builders, must have wielded enormous power to command the necessary labor. They must have cherished, too, a vast conception of their own importance, and a hope of immortality dependent on the preservation of the body, with its splendid furnishings of useful and luxurious objects. Similar tombs, though generally smaller, exist in various parts of Greece and in Crete. Those at Mycenae were plundered in ancient times, but elsewhere have been found in them remains of the dead and of rich offerings, whose character places this class of tombs immediately subsequent to those of the Mycenaean citadel. Character of the religion. Briefly, it may be said that the Minoan religion was an exceedingly complex system, which involved the worship of gods and of disembodied spirits, elaborate rituals performed by a specialized priesthood, the wearing of amulets suggestive of charms and magic, bloody sacrifices with their concomitant ideas of guilt and its purification, mysteries, divination, and oracles. It was a weird religion, well calculated as an instrument in the hands of a sacerdotal aristocracy, for holding the masses in check through supernatural terrors. Boxing, bull-leaping. Among the ancients, recreations connected closely with religion. The combative instinct of the Minoans is seen in their love of pugilism. Boxers were the cestus and assailed their opponents with hands and feet. Far more dangerous and exciting, however, was bull-leaping. The trick of the toreador seems to have been to meet the charging beast face to face, seize his horns, and, turning a somersault over his back, leap to the ground in the rear. Girls and youths, appropriately costumed, took part in the perilous sport, vividly pictured on the Cnosian palace walls. The gay lords and ladies must have witnessed many a bloody scene, in brutality comparable with the gladiatorial shows at Rome or with the bull-baiting of modern Spain. Doubtless these toreadors were forced to their dangerous vocation. Many may have been exacted as tribute from subject states. The myth that Athens had every 9 years to send 7 youths and 7 girls to be devoured by the Minotaur may accordingly contain this kernel of truth, and Theseus, who killed the monster, may have been in fact the liberator of his country. Chess, music, and dancing. From the excitement of this sport we may turn to watch the king playing with his court, favorite a game resembling chess or checkers, on an elaborate board still preserved. Or we may imagine an audience of courtiers listening to the musicians. We see a man playing a double pipe, another with a 7-stringed lyre in hand. The tradition, therefore, which represents Crete as the teacher of music to Hellas is true. To the accompaniment of such music twinkle the dancers' feet. The long, crimped tresses of the dancing girl float out in air. As she whirls around in the orchestra of the palace theatre, where Daedalus once wrote a dancing place for Ariadne of the lovely tresses. In our review of Minoan life, we have caught glimpses of a society clearly differentiated into poor and rich, commons and nobles, subjects and rulers, labor specialized into diverse crafts. Among the wealthy, a love of peaceful ease, luxury and beauty, coupled with a passion for brutal shows, and a religion uniting cheerful with gloomy features. The social organization evidently reveals the antecedents of the Dorian system. The field laborers were serfs or serf-like dependents, as were the helots of later time. Many towns were politically subject to Knossos, like the later Perioeci of Lacedaemon. There remained a class of nobles who possessed wealth and lived independently in private dwellings. The priest-king, however, or perhaps we should say god-king, aimed to concentrate life within his stupendous palace, to engage as many as possible of the inhabitants in the service of the state, and to measure out food to them at public tables. Thus the artist and the artisan class were brought into the palace. An effort was made also to create a military caste dependent on the state and equipped from the palace arsenal. It was a unique experiment in despotic socialism, but the system, devised by the king and his favorites, robbed the citizens of individuality and personal freedom. It compelled the masses to toil for the few, who exhausted the resources of the nation in art and extravagant luxury. The militarism of the late Minoan kings added to the waste. The archive records, though we cannot read them, point to a complex bureaucracy, like that of Egypt, which crushed the people by its weight, robbed them of the fruits of their toil, hence finally of their interest in life. Thus, in various ways, government and civilization, by sapping the energy of the governed in Crete and later on the Greek mainland, engendered internal decay. The artist lost his inventive power. Stagnation was inevitably followed by slow deterioration in every activity of life. Ethnology. It need not be supposed that in the long period extending from the early Neolithic age to the end of the Middle Minoan era, the population of the Aegean world remained the same. Uninterrupted development is not in itself evidence of continuity of race. And on the other hand, there may be changes of civilization which do not involve the substitution of one people for another. As to the language of this early time, there are only the slightest indications. Pre-Hellenic place names in Greece have their kin on the islands and in Asia Minor. This circumstance points to the diffusion of a single language by migration from east to west or the reverse. This tongue is certainly not Indo-European, but seems to be related to the Carian and Lycian. In the extensive Aegean area, there was room for more than one form of speech, and from time to time new peoples and tongues were introduced by immigration. The original home and early wanderings of the Indo-Europeans need not be considered in this volume, and in treating of their arrival in Greece we can only deal in probabilities. The opening of the late Minoan era, 1600, as we may reasonably believe, saw them in possession of all or nearly all Greece. The process of migration and settlement, however, continually modified their racial character. In fact, history knows no people of unmixed blood. Doubtless the Indo-Europeans in their common home were of various stocks. Their several tribes, as they journeyed gradually to their respective historical countries, absorbed all manner of alien peoples on the way, as usually happens with wandering hordes. Few, if any, who came into Greece were unmixed descendants of those who had left the Indo-European homeland. Then the newcomers in Greece began to blend with the natives, and were continually joined by many strangers from the islands, from Asia Minor, from Crete and elsewhere. The mingling of these diverse stocks through centuries ultimately produced the Greek race. Although many place names remained undisturbed, the language of the Northerners, rich in myths, strong, flexible and high capable of artistic treatment, prevailed. At the opening of the late Minoan era, 1600, Thessaly and Boeotia, still Neolithic, were held by the Aeolians. Attica, Euboea, and the east coast of Peloponnese by the Old Ionians. Central and southern Peloponnese by the Arcadians, an offshoot of the Aeolian group. West of the Aeolians was an area occupied, either at that time or somewhat later, by a people described simply as Northwestern Greeks. All these racial names, however, properly apply neither to the northern immigrants nor to the natives, but to the ultimate blend of the two races, and are here used anticipatively for convenience. The immigrants from the north were evidently a minority of the population, but superior virility gave their leaders a dominant place in their respective districts. It was not simply the mainland that began in this way to fall under Indo-European control. Evidently, individual adventurers with their attendants crossed to the islands, where by cleverness and personal superiority They attained to a place in the ruling classes and mingled their speech with that of the natives. Owing to such long-continued migratory disturbances, the peninsula had made but little progress in civilization, though appreciably more in the south than in the north. Before the close of the Middle Minoan Age, however, as the movements in Greece temporarily subsided, civilization began to develop there with surprising rapidity. On favorable sites along the coast, at a varying distance from the shore, as at Tiryns and Mycenae, at Athens and Orchomenus, at Vaphio, Laconia, and Old Pylos, Messenia, Hellenic chieftains built their fortress cities. In these mainland settlements, the most powerful civilizing influence was commerce with Crete. And yet we may well believe that throngs of Minoan architects and artisans came to seek employment in the new and stirring centers of political power. The king's abode, however, was not a copy of the Cnossian palace, but a development from a simpler European type, like that found in the second settlement at Troy. Its essential characteristic was a great hall with a central hearth, features unknown to contemporary Crete. To win his Minoan subjects and to centralize his power, the Hellenic king adopted the native religion, including the deification of the deceased sovereign and the building of a gigantic tomb for himself. The mighty walls around his city were a protection from the barbarous tribes that assailed him, and still more from the Cretan king. Hardly had the sovereign of Knossos united all Crete under his sway, than he began to extend his dominion to the more distant Aegean islands. Though he gained no foothold in Asia Minor, he threatened the coasts of Peloponnese, and probably made temporary conquests in Attica. With the political advance of Greece, however, his power receded. The kings of the Hellenic peninsula were gradually colonizing the islands. First sailed forth great piratical armadas, doubtless made up from several maritime kingdoms. In the 15th century, Melos was taken by one of these armaments, and its palace sacked and burned. In the new settlement which followed, the palace was of the whole type, and the culture in general was continental rather than Cretan. Evidently, a colony from Greece established itself in the midst of the native population. About 1400, Knossos experienced the same fate. The palace had attained to its utmost size and magnificence, but the mind of the race was stagnant. Court society, never more brilliant in appearance or more luxurious, was held in the thraldom of fashion. In brief, the whole life of Crete was fossilizing, like that of the contemporary Egypt. These conditions were suddenly brought to an end by the destruction of the palace. The blackened walls, the charred ends of beams, the almost complete absence of gold and bronze, seemed to proclaim the sack and burning of the city. As the same thing happened at Festus, at Hagia Triada, and elsewhere in Crete, we may infer that the catastrophe was due to no accident or dynastic revolution, or uprising of the masses. We can explain the event best by supposing it to have been the work of raiders, who swept over the wealthy cities of the island in their career of plunder. It may well be that the fleets of coast cities were joined in this enterprise by squadrons of barbarians from the interior of Europe, for desolating the fairest habitations thus far created by man. Succeeding to this devastation, a colony like that on Melos introduced mainland culture, amid the devitalized native population. The extreme poverty of the settlement is evidence that others must have enjoyed the movable wealth of the former city. From the beginning of the late Minoan age, disturbances in the Aegean Sea had turned the commercial enterprise of Crete in other directions. Minoans of this age, accordingly, planted colonies in the islands of the west coast of Greece, in southern Italy, and in Sicily. Through these settlements and through commerce, the Minoan system of life gained a foothold in all these regions. After the destruction of Knossos, a remnant of the population colonized Spain, while others found homes at Miletus and in Cyprus. A century afterward, Greek and Minoan tribes, migrating by sea and land, extended their piracies to the East Mediterranean waters and coasts. Early in the 13th century, they joined the Libyans in ravaging the Egyptian delta. A few generations later, the Peliset moved from the Minoan area through Asia Minor into Syria, with their families in curious, heavy two-wheeled ox carts, and by sea in a fleet that skirted the Syrian coast. Occupying a strip of shore country south of Phoenicia, they became known to history under the name of Philistines. Although far superior to the Asiatics in civilization, they adopted the Semitic language, and it was from them, most probably, that the Phoenicians derived the elements of their alphabet. These extensive migrations may be traced in part to a movement of European tribes southward into Thrace and the Balkan Peninsula. One of these tribes, the Phrygians, crossed the Hellespont, and occupying the central part of western Asia Minor, dislodged some of the natives of that region, who necessarily had recourse to migrations. Under the same southward pressure, northwestern Hellenes filtered into other parts of Greece. Some crossed into Thessaly and Boeotia, yet not in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the Aeolian dialect of these two countries. It remained purer in the former than in the latter. Meanwhile, other emigrants from the northwest were crossing into Peloponnese, where, too, they mingled with the earlier inhabitants. Thus arose Achaia, whose language was akin to that north of the Corinthian Gulf, and of more distantly related speech, the Dorians of Argolis and Laconia. From Argolis the Dorian dialect passed to Corinth and Megara, and from Laconia to Messenia. The dialect of Elis, likewise, points to a migration from across the Gulf. This movement of population from the northwest, represented in story as the Dorian migration, affected nearly the whole of the Greek peninsula. The people of Attica, however, had no tradition of a tribal migration into their country. They knew only of a peaceful infiltration of families, many of whom became noble. Arcadia, too, remained untouched. Its people had once extended over the coast region to the south, and in the late Minoan age many went off as colonists to Cyprus. Those who remained in Laconia were merged in the Dorian race, whereas the people of the interior highlands, under the name of Arcadians, maintained their original language and their racial character. Having adopted but little of the higher Minoan culture, they had little to lose by its downfall. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Middle Age. Transition from Minoan to Hellenic life. About 1200 to 750. At the time when migratory warriors were raiding the Egyptian delta or colonizing Philistia, The Minoan civilization was fast yielding to a more barbaric form of life. So notable was the decline that from about 1200 we may date the beginning of a new era, which was essentially a transition from Minoan to Hellenic life. The period thus defined bears close analogies with the later European Middle Ages, in that both were characterized not only by invasions of less civilized people, but also by a vast decline and an incipient recovery of culture. 1. Dorian and Ionian colonization and culture. For a long period after the beginning of this era, colonial expansion from the west to east across the Aegean Sea made progress. From Argolis and Laconia immigrants, first Achaean and afterward Dorian, made their homes in Melos and Thera, southmost islands of the Cyclades. In the same order, they occupied the choicest parts of Crete, which came thus to the ethnic complexion described by Homer. There is a land called Crete, in the midst of the wine-dark sea, a fair land and rich, begirt with water, and therein are men innumerable and 90 cities, and all have not the same speech, but there is a confusion of tongues. There dwell Achaeans, and there too Eteocretans, true Cretans, high of heart, and Sidonians there, and Dorians of waving plumes, and goodly Pelasgians. And among them is the mighty city of Knossos, wherein Minos rules in 9-year periods, he who had converse with great Zeus. Beyond Crete the Dorians pushed on to Carpathos, to Rhodes, and ultimately to the coast of the mainland. Among their cities on the Anatolian shore were Cnidus and Halicarnassus, both thriving centers of industry and commerce. The Greeks who came to Crete were attracted to the area which had experienced the highest cultural development, to Knossos, Gortyn, Festus, and their neighborhood. In the east the Eteocretans at Pressos maintained their nationality and their language far down in historical times. In the west were Sidonians, regarded by Homer as non-Greek, but certainly Dorian in the historical age. Because of the small number of Hellenic immigrants into this island, the process of assimilation was remarkably slow. Earlier perhaps than the Dorian colonization was the beginning of the movement from central Greece to the Cyclades, mentioned in the preceding chapter. Gradually this migration continued eastward, till it reached and included the narrow strip of territory on the Anatolian coast, afterward known as Ionia. On the site of Neolithic villages, these immigrants, in the period of Minoan decadence, founded small cities. To colonists from Crete were added adventurers from the Cyclades and from various parts of the Hellenic peninsula. In fact, it was a motley population that came, and they made themselves more heterogeneous by mingling with the natives. They have no right to pride themselves on purity of descent, says Herodotus, considering that a large part of them are Abantes from Euboea, who have no share even in the name of Ionia, and minions of Archomenus have been mingled with them, and Cadmians and Dryopians and Phocians, who seceded from their native state, and Molossians and Pelasgians of Arcadia, and Dorians of Epidaurus, and many other races have been mingled with them. And those of them who set forth from the Prytanion town hall of Athens, and who esteemed themselves the most noble by descent of the Ionians. These, I say, brought no women with them to the settlement, but took Carian captive women, whose parents they slew. So far were the newcomers from aiming at racial purity that they not only married native wives, but received Carian chieftains into their own nobility, and even accepted them as kings. In a varying degree, this principle of race mixing holds for all Greek colonies. Doubtless it was partly the composite nature of the population, as well as the lovely climate, the most favorable in the world known to Herodotus, the rich soil, the highly articulated coast adapted to commerce, and the situation on the borderland between Hellenic and Oriental civilizations, which made the Ionians for centuries the most brilliant and most versatile of Greeks, in the age of their glory the standard-bearers of the world's civilization. Among their most noted cities were Phocea, famed for her early naval power and her distant western colonies; Ephesus, where was built a great temple to Artemis; and Miletus, an illustrious center of industry, commerce, and intellectual life. In this new home, the Ionians were more aggressive and more powerful than their Hellenic neighbors. On the south, Dorian Halicarnassus, and in the opposite direction, Aeolic Chios and Smyrna, in time became Ionized, while commercial relations with Phoenicia gave the Semites the Ionian name in the form of Javan, with which to designate the entire Hellenic race. On the Greek mainland, the process of Hellenic assimilation was more rapid than elsewhere. There, apart from place names, no clear trace of a native tongue has been discovered. In considerable stretches of the eastern coast of Peloponnesus, as in Trezen and Kinuria, the Ionian dialect long maintained itself. Elsewhere in Argolis, the Dorian speech prevailed both in the country and in Tiryns, Mycenae, and Argos. Within the Middle Age, Argos gained a mastery over her rivals, and ultimately imposed her hegemony upon the peninsula that bears her name. In Laconia, our earliest historical light reveals a population essentially homogeneous in culture and in language. Some Mycenaean sites as Amyclae and Therapne were occupied by Hellenic cities, whereas Sparta, destined to a leading place in Greek history, was a wholly new foundation. Similarly, Attica, which had contained a number of Mycenaean sites, experienced as thorough an amalgamation of Hellenic and native races, and at the same time became politically centralized in its chief city, Athens. As the southmost section of the Aegean coasts and islands was occupied by the Dorian race, which was essentially one, though with slight differences of blood and dialect, so the Ionian name generally applied to the section extending from Attica to the Anatolian coast. Only as the Athenians awakened to a consciousness of their own superiority did they discard the Ionian name. In this section, too, of Aegean shores and islands, in spite of local differences in dialect and ethnic composition, the population was essentially one in language and in race, in political and religious institutions, and in social customs. For a long time the mother peoples were more conservative, the colonies more progressive. The most fundamental transformations of this period were the blending of the immigrant culture with that of the natives, and the gradual emergence of the Hellenic world from the turmoil and relative barbarism following upon the Indo-European invasions. In the case of many an institution or custom, it is difficult, or even impossible, with our present knowledge, to determine the nationality of its several elements. Some aspects of the transition may be traced most distinctly in Crete. After the destruction of Knossos and Festus, we find the Cretans thoroughly impoverished and devitalized, as is proved by their utter inability to repair the damage. When these sites came to be reoccupied with poor dwellings, the magnificent palace was in like manner superseded by a smaller and cheaper home, of the European type, built for a king of scant means and narrow sway. Art was the same in technique, but all inspiration was gone. Naturalism yielded to stiff geometric patterns. This style, after remaining in the background from the early Bronze Age, now reasserted itself. The graceful spirals, octopi, flowers, leaves, and tendrils of the Minoan culture were driven from the field by zigzags, triangles, checkers, and meanders. The same changes were taking place throughout the Minoan area. They were in fact most pronounced on the Greek peninsula, whence they extended to the rest of the Aegean region. The artistic worth varied according to locality, from the barbarous specimens found in earlier Sparta to the far more graceful forms of Crete and Rhodes, where Minoan traditions were relatively strong. Everywhere the quality improved throughout the age. For obvious reasons, the Renaissance was speediest in Crete. Her artistic activity of this period is typified by the mythical Daedalus, whose fame finds an echo in the Iliad. Before the close of the period, however, the Cretans were outdistanced by the Ionians, who, having passed from the decadent Minoan to the geometric style, rapidly emerged from this condition. Their artists adopted for vase paintings and ornamental work, in ivory, bronze, and silver, more lifelike representations of man and nature, with a tendency to processional and heraldic groupings, with a fondness for winged men, women, and beasts, and for human-headed animals. These features, commonly described as orientalizing, may have been due to contact with the East in the early Middle Age, but had developed to a degree of artistic merit far superior to their Oriental patterns. Contributions to this stage of progress were made not only by Aegean Greeks, but also by the Phoenicians, who too were heirs of Minoan culture. Their geographical situation on a narrow coast made them a seafaring folk. On the downfall of the Cretan naval power, their mariners voyaged into the Aegean Sea, where they traded with the Greeks in the manner described by Homer. Their chief service to civilization was a transmission of writing from the Minoans to the Hellenes of the Middle Age. The Minoan linear script, comprising word signs and syllable signs, gradually grew simpler, chiefly through the dropping of characters. In Cyprus it was limited to syllabic signs, and in Syria a further step was taken when the number of these signs was reduced to 22, each standing for a single consonantal sound, whereas the vowels remained unrepresented. Receiving this script from the Phoenicians, probably about 900, the Ionians transformed it into a phonetic alphabet. Till the opening of the 7th century, however, its use remained extremely rare. Meanwhile, Greeks and Phoenicians continued to interchange wares and art patterns. As the Ionians were the more highly endowed race, it is likely that they gave more than they received, and that much which has hitherto been described as Phoenician should be credited to the Greeks. From the 9th to the 7th century, accordingly, it was not the Phoenicians but the Ionians who were leaders in the geometric and orientalizing art which extended from the Euphrates to Italy and Sicily. In an age of general poverty, we find throughout the area, once Minoan, a remarkable tendency to refinement and luxury, among the nobles most noticeable in the Ionians. In peace, especially during the sumptuous religious festivals, they indulged in the luxury of trailing gowns of linen, richly dyed in colors from the purple mollusk, and adorned themselves with a profusion of jewelry. Their costliest and most artistic works still surviving are gold ornaments of various forms and silver cups, plates, and shields, all richly decorated with scenes from mythical or real life. Everywhere, too, the Greeks of this period cultivated singing and enjoyed the music of the lyre and pipe. The geometric motive which prevailed till near the end of the period was derived in part from weaving, and the nobles and kings wore robes adorned with inwoven or embroidered patterns in the prevailing art. In fact, the entire life of this area was undergoing a profound transformation, manifested as distinctly in dress as in any other external feature of society. The laborer, conservative and economical, continued even in historical Greece to wear the waistcloth. The chiton, obviously a Semitic word meaning linen, was a newer garment sewn in the form of a sleeveless shirt, which covered the body and hips, and which could be girt in at the waist by a broad belt. A more stately chiton, adapted to gods and kings, doubtless too the holiday attire of all who could afford the luxury, reached from neck to ankles. The tightness of the dress, whether short or long, is a heritage from Minoan costume. Still more conservative was the garb of women. The goddess Artemis Orthia at Sparta wore a robe seemingly composed of a low-cut waist with shoulder straps, belt and tight skirt of strongly Minoan aspect. A great innovation of the age, however, was the fibula, a safety pin of varying form and complexity, which brought about a revolution in dress. This method of fastening was used in the peplos, a woman's gown which reached from neck to feet. It was a rectangular cloth folded double above the waistline, and drawn up under the belt so as to form a pouch around the body. Gradually prevailing over all other styles, it became the Doric gown of the historical age. The hair of women and men alike grew long and hung down in several heavy strands on both sides of the face, held in order by a band encircling the head. Although these articles of dress began to appear early in the Mycenaean period, it was not till the Middle Age that they displaced the Minoan patterns. One of the most important constructive elements in the new civilization, which gradually emerged from the ruins of the old, was the rise of the iron industry. In the 14th century this manufacture was well developed in the Hittite country of eastern Asia Minor. The metal was mined in the region afterward known as Pontus, and the process of hardening it to steel is indicated by its use for sword blades. Thus writes a Hittite king to another person, probably the Egyptian pharaoh: "As regards your writing to me for pure iron, there is no pure iron prepared in my storehouse. As soon as it is ready, I will forward it to you. Now I am sending to you an iron sword blade." The use of the metal for tools and weapons, extending westward, reached Crete in the 13th century, where iron axes, picks, swords, and spearheads have been found in and about some beehive tombs of that age. Thence its use passed more slowly over the disturbed Aegean area to Laconia, Attica, and Thessaly, and to their colonies. Its penetration into Laconia seems to have been especially slow. Although from the beginning of the period bronze objects abound in Laconian deposits, no iron has been found in the strata below the 8th century. In fact, the immigrants of Doric speech arrived in Peloponnese in the early transition from bronze to iron. While the metal was still scarce, the Peloponnesians, like other Greeks, began to use it as money. The pieces so employed were in the form of a spit or of a round bar. Still later came the use of this metal in tools and weapons. The superior power of steel in weapons of attack rendered necessary the strengthening of the defensive armor. The round or oval targe, reinforced by a central bronze boss, took the place of the huge man-covering shield, which, however, lingered on by the side of the improved pattern. At the same time, the warrior protected his head with a helmet, topped by a high bronze crest, his body with a hauberk of metal plates that opened in front and behind, and bronze greaves for the legs below the knees. Those who had the means and the intelligence to procure the improved equipment gained through it a political superiority over their neighbors. The working of the iron mines in Mount Aegetus, which separates Laconia from Messenia, accrued to the advantage of the Spartans, who waged frequent wars of conquest with their weaker neighbors, with the result that before the end of the 8th century they had brought all Laconia under their sway. In the intervals of peace they exercised their prowess in hunting wild animals on the neighboring mountains. In like manner, the Ionians of Greece and the adjacent islands drew iron from the mines of Euboea and Seriphos. As in the Minoan age, the noble, equipping himself with heavy armor, rode to war in a cart driven by his squire. When before the close of the period the chariot was discarded, the noble bestrode his steed and rode to battle, his mounted squire by his side. Or he took command of a light galley, propelled by oars and a mast, and armed with a submarine ram for assailing the enemy's craft. Corresponding changes were taking place in religion. For a time the cremation of the dead, doubtless accompanied by a weakening of belief in the power of ghosts, tended to supersede inhumation. But in the end the burial of the unburned body, without wholly displacing the other form, prevailed, though in tombs too small to be looked upon as dwellings. Men continued accordingly to worship the dead. Still greater reverence was paid to heroes, who, as sons or near descendants of the gods, were gigantic in stature and strength. Having lived mightily among men, they died and were buried. But their spirits remained powerful to harm or bless. Greatest of all heroes was Heracles, whose cult was already widespread over Hellas. Many heroes remained local. The Spartans worshipped Menelaus and Helen at a great hero shrine, Heroon, on the left bank of the Eurotas, whereas the chief hero of the Athenians was Theseus, to whom, while king, they ascribed the political unification of Attica. The Indo-European and Minoan religions gradually melted into one. The northern invaders adopted Minoan Artemis and Aphrodite, apparently with little change. The immigrants to Miletus were as receptive of native cults as of native blood. The desire to secure the protection of the local deities and the goodwill of the Carians went hand in hand with greed for the properties of these gods. Identifying their own sky deity Zeus with the god of the double axe, they converted the shrines and sacred domains of the Carian deity to their own service. In like manner, their Artemis usurped the property and various attributes of the great mother Cybele. Elsewhere, Zeus was identified with the son of Cretan Rhea. The character and attributes of the archer Apollo, especially his healings, purifications, and oracles, seem to be in considerable part Minoan. These are mere suggestions of that amalgamation, which, with our present knowledge, it is impossible to analyze in detail. At least we are warranted in assuming that no deity of historical Greece may safely be regarded as purely Indo-European or purely Minoan, and that the native race, endowed with a creative genius in religion as in art, contributed far more than the incoming Northerners to Hellenic belief and ritual. The prevailing tendency today is to assign to the invading people the sunnier aspects of religion, while leaving to the natives the gloomy features including magic, the worship of ghosts, the doctrine of sin, and its purification by washing in blood. It is significant, too, that, as in the Minoan past, the great deities of the Middle Age were mainly goddesses, such as Athena at Athens, Artemis at Sparta and Ephesus, and Hera at Argos. The worship of these heavenly women was intimately bound up with the public life of the cities, wherein they severally made their homes. The dwelling of the deity imitated the European type of palace. In the 9th century, the Spartans erected to Artemis Orthia, a temple consisting of a wooden frame, with walls of unburnt brick resting on a foundation of stone. The apex of the gabled roof was supported by an interior row of wooden columns, running lengthwise through the center. It was a small building, less than 15 by 30 feet in extent, designed mainly as a shelter for the deity and her utensils and gifts, whereas the worshippers gathered about the great altar outside. The goddess herself, represented by a piece of wood rudely carved, was so small that the priestess could hold it in her hands. In origin a nature goddess, she gave fertility to flocks and fields, and was patroness of youths in their athletic training, and of girls who worshipped her in choral song and in masked nocturnal processions. Summarily, the Dorians and Ionians, occupying the area once most thoroughly permeated with Minoan culture, were its principal heirs. In material civilization, religion, government, and social structure, they were essentially alike, and it was owing chiefly to developments beginning near the close of the Middle Age, above all to the brilliant growth of industry, commerce, and intellectual life among the Ionians, that in the historical period the leading communities of the two races differed widely from each other. 2. Aeolian colonization and culture. While Ionians and Dorians were occupying the central and southern parts of the Aegean islands and Anatolian coasts, the Aeolians of Thessaly and Boeotia were engaged in a parallel movement of colonization. They settled in Lesbos, where Mytilene gained the first rank in population and power. Chios, too, they occupied. On the adjoining mainland they founded 12 settlements, among which were Kyme and Smyrna. The Aeolian colonists had been but slightly touched by Minoan culture, and only in its decadent form. Most of them were men of new blood and fresh ideas, the first Europeans whom we can clearly know. In all probability, it is mainly their life that is pictured by Homer. His age, home, and personality are still under controversy. Are the epics attributed to him, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the work of one poet or of a long succession of minstrels? Whether an individual or a collective unit, did Homer live on the Greek mainland or in the Anatolian colonies, soon after the close of the Minoan age, hence about 1100 or 3 centuries later? Do his poems picture a single phase or successive phases of culture? These problems are still pressing for solution. The present volume has no space for the details of the controversy. It must limit itself to the presentation of a view which seems to the writer most reasonable in the light of the known facts. Most probably the Minoans, like the contemporary Orientals, had a written literature of chronicles, songs, and epics. However, that may be centuries before Homer. Achaean minstrels chanted lays of war and adventure in the palaces of the glorious Minoan age. Through song and story, the memories of Minoan splendor were vividly retained to the end of the colonial period. Tradition may well have been aided by the survival here and there of an old palace, and more abundantly of rich furniture, gold cups, inlaid swords, and other artistic objects, preserved as heirlooms in the families of the great. In these ways, material from the Golden Age and from that of decadence came down to the time of Homer, who well knew the art, though not the artists. The minstrel predecessors of Homer lived in Thessaly and its neighborhood. The gods are therefore Thessalian, their home is Mount Olympus. The Thessalian local coloring is strong, and the political, social, and religious atmosphere is European rather than Minoan. Among the colonists to Asia Minor came bards, with their lays and traditions, and there the struggle of the immigrants with a strange environment stimulated the poetic genius to heroic efforts. Among them was Homer, the supreme genius of epic song. His home was Smyrna or Chios, where dwelt Aeolians and Ionians mixed. His dialect, accordingly, combines those of the two races, while the life of his neighborhood is Aeolic, modified by Ionian influence. He lived about 800 and may have composed both Iliad and Odyssey, not by incorporating earlier lays or by merely adding to an existing epic, but by totally new creations, yet from tradition contained in extant songs. After his time, his poems underwent some changes, especially during the 8th and 7th centuries. Thus it happened that Homer's poems, which are mainly Indo-European, became the inspiration and the literary models of the historical Greeks. The life he pictures is not homogeneous, but a mingling of the traditional and the ideal with contemporary facts. Living no long time after an age of colonization, Homer knew how a city was founded. The Phaeacians of old, he informs us, dwelt in Hyperia, near the Cyclops, who continually vexed them. Thence the godlike Nausithous made them depart, and he carried them away and planted them in Scheria, far off from men that live by bread. And he drew a wall about the town, and built houses and made shrines for the gods and meted out the fields. He became king of the city, and at his death his scepter passed to his son. The land was distributed on an aristocratic principle. Wood and pasture remained common to all, whereas special domains were reserved for the king and the gods, while to the great men, the king's counselors and commanders of troops in war, were granted large estates to be worked by their slaves, hired men, or tenants. The common freeman received a lot in the city for his dwelling, and in the country a field for cultivation. Such ownership of land as existed was vested in the family, and was not subject to transfer by sale. Country life. Slaves and common freemen lived the crudest lives, devoid of every comfort. The hut of the swineherd had no table, chair, or bed. Laertes, driven from the throne of Ithaca because of old age, retired to the country where he lived a poor man. Thy father abides there in the field, and goes not down to the town. Nor lies he on bedding, or rugs, or shining blankets, but all the winter he sleeps where sleep the thralls in the house, in the ashes by the fire, and is clad in sorry raiment. But when the summer comes, and the rich harvest tide, his beds of fallen leaves are strewn lowly, all about the knoll of his vineyard plot. There he lies sorrowing. We see the same old man in the terraced vineyard, digging about a plant, clothed in a filthy chiton, patched and unseemly, with clouted leggings of oxhide bound about his legs, against the scratches of the brambles, and long sleeves over his hands by reason of the briars, and on his head he wore a goatskin cap, or trudging home weary at night to receive his food prepared by an old Sicilian woman. Out of keeping with his sorry life is the fact that he was the proprietor of a rich and well-ordered farm that he had won for himself of old as the prize of great toil in war. There was his house, and all about it ran the huts, wherein the thralls were wont to eat and dwell and sleep, bondsmen that worked his will. We watched the labourers plough, plant, reap, thresh, dig trenches, build stone fences, fell trees, and dispute over the boundaries of their fields. They produced nearly everything they needed. They rarely went to town to purchase bronze or iron for their forges, and they seemed to have been cut off from all political life. The city. The city was small. Therein lived the king, the noble and wealthy with their household slaves, and the common agricultural class whose estates were conveniently near. There too dwelt potters, curriers, bronzesmiths, and a few merchants, who dealt in useful metals and in imported Eastern luxuries. Into the harbor sailed Phoenicians, in their ships laden with countless goods, and while they traded, they kidnapped children, profitably combining commerce with robbery. Among a people of action, the pirate was more esteemed than the lazy merchant. The city was but rudely fortified. The palace was like the Mycenaean of simple form, consisting of a great hall with central hearth, bath and sleeping rooms, and a vestibule leading to a front court. The splendid furnishings described by Homer were either heirlooms or a mere memory of a richer and more cultured age. Government, the king. The Homeric government contrasts with the Minoan. The monarchy appears in its simplest elements. Yet the enormous pretensions of the king may be a breath from the Minoan south. He was a near descendant, preferably a great-grandson of Zeus or some other god. His honor, too, was from Zeus, Lord of Counsel, who cherished him, granted him glory, and furnished him even with thoughts. His scepter, the sign of his power, was made in heaven and given by a god to the founder of his dynasty. The people, therefore, prayed and hearkened to him as to a god. Here we have an approach to the Oriental god-king. Among the Greeks of Homer's time, however, these vast boastings were empty. The king maintained his place only by superior personal ability, as in semi-barbarous life, and his power depended on the number of troops he led. Thus with Agamemnon followed the most and goodliest folk by far, and in their midst himself was clad in flashing bronze, all glorious, and was preeminent amid all warriors, because he was goodliest and led folk far greatest in number. Relations were personal, and no theory of government or even idea of government in the abstract had yet arisen. Ordinarily the kingship was hereditary, yet if the son was too young or otherwise incompetent, the scepter might pass to a brother or other relative. Occasionally a new family came to the scepter. In Ithaca some kind of popular election was thought of to fill the throne of Odysseus, in case the natural heir should not succeed. For support the king depended on the great estate attached to the scepter, personal or family property, gifts from his subjects, his large share of booty, and choice portions of sacrificial victims. He wore no crown or purple robe, but dressed and equipped himself little better than other nobles. The state. In this period and among these people, the state was a crude, undeveloped institution, with functions correspondingly few and ill-defined. The duty clearly conceived of protecting the population from foreign enemies made the king a general, the commander-in-chief of the army. The need of protecting the state itself from domestic foes, from treason and rebellion, gave him judicial power. It was no less incumbent upon the government to avert the anger of the gods and to secure their goodwill and beneficence. From this need arose the king's priestly character. Notable is the fact that the state had not yet acquired the function of protecting the lives and property of the citizens. That was a private affair. One who slew another fled from the country to escape the vengeance of the murdered man's kin, or remained on condition of paying a sum acceptable to the kinsman. With such things the government had nothing to do. Likewise, it was incumbent on each individual to protect his own property from thieves and robbers. There were no police or officers of justice, and in time of peace no army. It often happened, however, that the disputants brought their case for arbitration to the king, queen, or councillors. In the famous trial scene pictured on the shield of Achilles, the question seems to be whether the slayer has paid the blood money to the kin. The folk were gathered in the assembly place, for there a strife was arisen. Two men striving for the blood price of a man slain. The one claimed he had paid full atonement, expounding to the people, but the other denied him and would take naught, and both were fain to receive judgment at the hands of an arbiter, and the folk were cheering both as they took part on either side. and heralds kept order among the folk, while the elders on polished stones were sitting in the sacred circle and holding in their hands staves from the loud-voiced heralds. Then, before the people, they rose up and gave judgment each in turn. And in the midst lay 2 talents of gold, to give to him who should plead most righteously. Probably the counselor who received the loudest applause from the people was deemed the wisest judge. Here is the faint beginning of popular jurisdiction, which culminated in the courts of Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The council. The king was absolute only on the battlefield, where he exercised the power of life and death. It is true that there was no constitutional way of checking him, or of calling him to account. But in point of fact he was limited by the Council of Elders and by the popular assembly. The members of the council, Bulli, had the same honors and titles as the king. They too are scepter-bearing kings and fosterlings of Zeus. The king was himself a counselor and merely the first among equals. Whereas the council was an essential element of government, the king was not so considered, as his presence was unnecessary to the assembly of that body or the transaction of business by it. Individual members rebuked him sharply, denounced him as unfit to rule, and often disobeyed his command. They were haughty, quarrelsome, and insubordinate. The right to sit in council. The right to give advice depended on the wisdom of age. Hence the members were called elders. On lineage or success in war. The number was small, never more than a dozen. A man of influence in the community, especially with the ability to raise and command military forces, was sure to be given a place in the council by the king. And when once a seat was established, it became hereditary. Usually the councillors assembled round the table of the king, and began business after partaking of his hospitality. The discussion lasted till all agreed. The idea of voting or of majority was totally absent. There were no specialized functions or departments of administration. Individually and collectively, the councillors assisted and limited the king in all his duties, military, judicial, and religious. Though they had no legal way of coercing the king, their collective will generally prevailed. It required but a slight shift in the political balance to change the kingship into an aristocracy. In the absence of Odysseus, his country was kingless, virtually an aristocracy, at the mercy of turbulent, avaricious nobles, in whom the poet, whose sympathies were with the royal family, could recognize no legitimate authority. The Assembly of Commons. For the commons, the Zeus-nurtured prince cherished supreme contempt. But in practice he had to heed their will. In war all fighters, in peace all men, within or near the city, attended the assembly called by king or noble. Often the question brought before them had previously been considered in council. They were usually such as affected the people and whose execution required their cooperation. The chief speakers were the king and councillors, though commoners were not wholly debarred. The commons expressed assent by shouting. Their disapproval by silence points to remarkable self-restraint. Ordinarily their opinion prevailed. In their gathering lay a germ of democracy, which was to grow and ripen to perfection in Greek states like Athens. The tendency of the time, however, was to abridge this influence in the aristocratic interest. In Ithaca, during the king's long absence, the nobles neglected to summon it. They themselves all together went to the assembly place, and suffered none others to sit with them, either of the young men or of the elders. By degrading the office of the king and by neglecting to call the assembly, or by restricting it to their own kinsmen and partisans, the nobles were already converting the monarchy into an aristocracy. Religion. In the religion of Homer we find a striking contrast with the Minoan age. The people of whom he speaks feared no ghosts, nor venerated heroes or fetishes, or the dead or monsters. The few abnormal creatures who existed in imagination were not the objects of worship. All the gods had human form, and with the exception of the lame smith Hephaestus, all were models of beauty. They differed from men only in their superior stature, strength, and physical perfection, in the character of their food and drink, ambrosia and nectar, in their dwelling place and life of ease, and in their immortality. They needed sleep, suffered pain, and were sometimes wounded by men in battle. Though Zeus was superior, all were limited in knowledge and power. They pursued their several inclinations, now in disobedience to Zeus, now winning him by persuasion or cajolery. At times his throne, like that of the mortal king, was insecure, and again his vast superiority seems to indicate a growing monotheism. The council and society of the gods. The great deities dwelt together as a family on the summit of snowy Olympus. There they spent their time in happy feasting, or schemed and quarreled. Or under the presidency of Zeus, father of gods and men, they sat in council on the destinies of humankind. Their society was a reflection from that of earth, yet freer from moral restraint. They had all the evil as well as good qualities of man. Indeed, the poet appears to take delight in holding up the frailties of some, as Aphrodite and Ares to ridicule. Their relation with men. In their dealings with men they were moved by caprice. They helped those whom they loved and brought misfortune on the objects of their hate, or upon those who neglected sacrifice or the fulfillment of a vow to them. Yet in a limited measure they were the protectors of right and the avengers of wrong. Yea, and the gods, taking on all manner of forms in the likeness of strangers from foreign lands, wander through the cities, beholding the insolence and the righteous spirit of men. They rewarded the good, but loved not evil deeds. Morally imperfect, like human beings, these gods, as Homer represents them, with their clear-cut, athletic forms, their majestic beauty, their incessant free activity, were the chief inspiration of Hellenic sculpture, from the 6th century through the period of its acme and decline. Priests and temples, seers. Homer knew no priestly caste or hierarchy. The gods were so near to men as to demand no intermediaries. The father prayed and sacrificed for the family, the king and nobles for the state, and each individual for himself. Here and there were temples, most of them doubtless only large enough to shelter an image. Such a shrine was under the care of a priest, who, though dear to the gods, was as a rule not a noble, or in any way superior to other men. Seers were classed along with craftsmen. Calchas, the most celebrated, refers to himself as a man of inferior social rank. The nobles had not yet monopolized religion or converted it to a political instrument. The dead. In the treatment of the dead and in their view of the spirit life, the Homeric Greeks were far removed from the Minoans. Vestiges of embalming may have been borrowed from the south, but the Aeolians of Homer always burned the body and deposited the ashes in an urn, over which they heaped a cairn. On the top of this mound they set a pillar. In general opinion, all souls passed unconditionally to the realm of Hades, in the far west, or beneath the earth, there to lead a shadowy, joyless existence. The shade of Achilles says, "Speak not comfortably to me of death, glorious Odysseus. I should rather be upon the field as the servant of another, of one who had no land and little property, than a king of all the dead." Elysium. Once only the poet speaks of a future world of happiness, the Elysian plain in the extreme west, where life is easiest for man. No snow is there, nor yet great storm, nor any rain, but always ocean sendeth forth the breeze of the shrill west to blow cool on men. There dwells fair-haired Rhadamanthus, brother of Minos, and thither the gods will carry Menelaus, because he has Helen to wife, and through her is deemed a son of Zeus. Thus this paradise is open to a few favorites of the gods. Morals. In moral living, the Homeric Greeks derived little aid from their deities. It is true that religion taught them to pity and protect stranger suppliants, to honor parents, to refrain from overweening pride, and in a general way, by precept rather than by the example of the gods, to cultivate righteousness. But their moral progress, whatever it was, must be attributed to purely human effort. Their virtues were preeminently military, above all physical strength and bravery. The bad man was the coward and weakling. Wisdom was the skill in the use of arms or in the management of men, or shrewdness in daily life. The Greeks were proverbially deceitful, and Homer's gods and men indulge in clever lying. Yet Achilles exclaims, "Hateful to me as the gates of Hades is the man who conceals one thing in his breast and speaks another." Patience, temperance, and self-control are commended in the hero Odysseus. The spirit of justice and general good order within the state and the army is pronounced. The number of crimes is remarkably few, in view of the lack of supervision on the part of the government. Family life. Perhaps the most charming feature of Homeric life is the love of husband and wife, of parents and children, the affection which binds the family together in a moral unity. This bond was drawn the closer by the circumstance that, unaided by the state, the family had to protect its own property and lives and avenge its wrongs. The father was head of the family, but the mother's place was equally honorable, and descent through her was highly esteemed. Her father had received for her hand a bright price in oxen, which went to her as dowry, and the lady of rank chose her husband from among the suitors. Women sat with men in the great hall, and went about freely in city and country. Sometimes the queen alone held the royal office. This honorable and influential place of woman was one to which Indo-European and Minoan sentiments and usages alike contributed. It is true that her pacific nature and her physical inferiority made her the prey of war, the victim of the brutal conqueror, and often her husband's lack of respect for the marriage bond subjected her to distressing humiliation. Yet, at least in the higher class, these disadvantages were in part made good by the love and honor, the chivalrous treatment and social power accorded her alike by kin, townspeople, and guests from other states. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Economic Growth and Colonial Expansion. BC 750 to 479. Agriculture. The decline of Minoan culture had been accompanied by a vast depopulation, made good only in part by the infiltration of strangers. In the Middle Age, forests grew up over many a field that had once been tilled or occupied by human dwellings. As the Hellenes emerge from the darkness of that time, we find them, at the close of the 8th century, chiefly engaged in grazing and agriculture. There remained abundant public land on the mountain slopes, on which the citizens freely pastured their flocks and cut wood for fuel and building. The arable fields were the property of king, gods, associations of various kinds, and citizen families. Our chief source for the beginning of this period is Hesiod's Works and Days. He instructs the peasant proprietor first of all to get a cottage and a woman and an ox for plowing, and all necessary furnishings in his house, for neighbors do not like to lend. Keep a sharp-toothed dog, stint not his food, lest a day-slumbering man rob thee of thy belongings. His advice is directed chiefly, however, to the small country esquire, whose manor house stands near the group of slave cabins. Yet even on such an estate life is simple and full of toil. The lord labors along with his slaves. They use a wooden plough drawn by a pair of steers, a mattock for breaking the clods, and a rude two-wheeled cart for conveyance. They have no mill for grinding grain, wheat or more commonly barley and spelt, but crush it in a mortar after threshing it on a hard-beaten floor. Their grain and wine they store for the winter in large earthen jars, as had been done in the Minoan age. The labors of the seasons they regulate according to the movements of the stars and the phenomena of plant and animal life. The rising of Arcturus announces spring, and when they see the snails climbing the plants, they sharpen sickles for the harvest. Life is an endless round of toil, with a slight relaxation in the coldest month, when the fierce northeast wind brings to earth many a lofty oak and branching pine in the mountain dells, or in the hottest summer, when the tuneful cicadae shrilly sing, it is permitted the Lord to rest in a shady grotto, while he eats his roast kid or beef and drinks his Biblian wine well mixed with water. We catch but one pleasing glimpse of indoor life, where the unwedded, tender girl bides near her dear mother. After bathing and anointing herself with oil, she sleeps peacefully during the night, while out of the doors the homeless polypus gnaws his own foot in dismal haunts. Conditions in Attica were similar. Besides grain and grapes, this country produced an abundance of honey, figs, and olives. The oil was used for anointing the body, and in the preparation of food and much remained for exportation. The government carefully regulated the planting and care of trees, the location of hives, the digging of ditches, and the use of water from public and private wells. Country life grows difficult. The incoming northerners had infused Hellas with a tremendous physical vitality. The rapid increase of population made country life more and more difficult. Peasant estates, divided equally among the sons, soon became too small to support a family even in a prosperous season. And when the crops failed, the situation of the poorer farmers grew desperate. "Better it is," says Hesiod, "to bring up but a single son, especially as heirs often waste the estate in litigation, and the judges are ready to give the verdict to the one who brings the largest bribe. The common man in the hands of a magistrate is like a nightingale in the hawk's clutches. It is well, therefore, eschewing litigation, to work and save and avoid borrowing." In Attica, a mortgage pillar was placed on the farm of the debtor, and in failure to pay, the estate fell to the creditor. In such a case, the debtor generally became a tenant on the land he once had owned, paying his lord a sixth part of the produce. Further borrowing placed a mortgage on the security of his own person, or on that of his wife or children. Such debts were hopeless, and served as a step to slavery. Some escaped their doom by flight. In Boeotia, day slumbering highwaymen infested the roads. Round the smith's forge, or in the rude clubhouses of the village, gathered throngs of homeless beings, who filled their idle hours with evil plots. Everywhere in Attica stood mortgage pillars, holding black earth in slavery. Many peasants, once free, toiled trembling under their masters' caprices. Many others were sold, often illegally, into foreign lands. The agricultural population was fast falling into slavery. The liberation of the Attic peasantry by Solon will be considered in another chapter. The gloomy outlook filled the Boeotian poet with darkest forebodings for the human race. While, however, he was reiterating his only proposal for a cure, work and save, the problem was elsewhere, finding solution in the growth of skilled labor. The rise of industry. During the Middle Age, the highly developed Minoan industries had almost disappeared, and in the semi-barbarism of the period, mankind reverted to the primitive custom of making at home nearly everything needed in house or field. The village smith and potter wrought for their immediate neighborhood. In the coast towns were shipwrights skilled in building the small, round-bottomed boats of the time, propelled by a sail and at most by 30 oars. With the help of his slaves, the lord built his own house, and women wove the necessary garments. Only the rich could purchase a few luxuries, as tapestries, jewelry, and medicine, from Ionian or Phoenician traders, or beautifully dyed woolens and linens brought from Lydia and Caria. Gradually, however, as life became more settled, and wealth accumulated in the hands of lords, arose a demand for better wares than could be supplied by unskilled hands. To meet this need, some of the poor who felt cramped on their little farms, or were made homeless by economic oppression, began manufacturing on a small scale. Those who had skill and thrift grew wealthy. Many an impoverished lord betook himself to such an occupation, and many a wealthy noble invested part of his capital in trade. Men of the same branch of industry banded themselves together for mutual encouragement and protection. The guild, thus arising, patterned itself after the gens, for blood was the firmest bond which united men. As the Alcmeonidae were sons of Alcmeon, the smiths of Athens called themselves the sons of bronze, Chalcidae. There were too the Praxirgidae, handicrafts' sons, and various other artisan guilds. In these times work was no disgrace, and the fact that in early Attica the guilds won political privileges speaks well for their reputation. Slavery. Hand in hand with skilled industry developed slavery. A workman who could buy a single slave for his shop became a capitalist on a small scale, which was generally enlarged with future purchases, till the master outrivaled the old noble in wealth, and could contend with him for political supremacy. The growth of industry was accordingly interwoven with the political and constitutional development of Greece. Lydian, Ionian, and Lesbian industries. The industries of the New Age had their principal origin in Ionia and her neighbor Lydia, a country of diverse natural resources. Hence it was that in the 7th century Lydian headbands, sandals, and golden ornaments for the person were among the most highly prized luxuries of Hellas. Soon, however, these products were excelled by the brilliant efforts of Ionians and Lesbians. Miletus won fame for her finely woven woolens, of rich violet, saffron, purple, and scarlet colors, and her rare embroideries for the decoration of hats and robes. Doubtless her workshops produced a wide range of wares, not mentioned in history, such as were demanded by the increasing refinement of her civilization. Second only to Miletus were other cities of Ionia, and Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. Notably, Glaucus of Chios discovered a process for welding iron, which proved invaluable in the useful and fine arts. About the same time, certain Samians introduced bronze casting into Greece from the Orient. Aegina and Chalcis. Naturally, the extension of skilled industry over Greece was from east to west. Aegina, whose scant soil forced the people to industry and commerce, produced bronze work, such as cauldrons, tripods, and sculptured figures and groups, in addition to small wares of various kinds. In Euboea, on the Strait of Euripus, Chalcis became a thriving industrial city. With bronze obtained in part from neighboring mines, and with purple mollusk caught in the strait, she manufactured wares for war and peace, and costly dyes for kings and nobles. Corinth. In industry and commerce, Chalcis had eventually to yield to Corinth, from early time renowned for wealth. Its citadel was Acrocorinthus, a steep and lofty peak commanding a view of the isthmus below, and of a wide expanse of country all about. The two harbors, one on the Saronic Gulf, the other on the Corinthian, afforded easy commerce with the east and the west. To avoid the hazardous doubling of Cape Malea, ships were unloaded their freight, which under a toll to the city was transported across the isthmus. Early dreams of a canal were idle, but in time was constructed a tramway for hauling ships across. The city was not simply a mart, but a thriving center of industry, which produced vases showing Oriental influence, bronze wares for utensils and arms, well-woven and beautifully dyed woolen fabrics for clothing and tapestries. Even the Ionians, not content with their rich native fabrics, welcomed the Corinthian robes of purple, sea green, hyacinth, violet, and brilliant red. In the vases were exported wines, olive oil, and toilet ointments. These activities were fostered by the government. The king had been supplanted by the members of his gens, the Bacchiadae, who, forming a close aristocracy, refused intermarriage with any other class. During their 90 years of rule, 647 to 557, they developed the useful and decorative arts to a high stage of excellence, and in friendly cooperation with Chalcis, they extended their lines of traffic in various directions. Megara and Attica. Immediately to the north of Corinth was Megara, a little city-state with a narrow territory extending across the isthmus. The soil was stony, scarcely fit for anything but grazing. This condition compelled the Megarians to manufacture, with their scant means, coarse woolens and heavy potteries, and from both their narrow coasts to traffic with the east and west. In the 7th and 6th centuries, Attica remained essentially agricultural. It did export, however, oil and probably wine, in beautifully painted vases. Her great industrial and commercial development belongs to the following period. Other centers of industry and traffic will be mentioned in other connections. Colonial expansion, about 750 to 550. With the economic development of the period is closely connected a great movement of colonial expansion. While in agricultural districts, the departure of emigrants lightened the burden of excessive population, the growth of thriving cities demanded not only an increased food supply, but an importation of raw materials from distant countries and markets for manufactured products. Added to the need of an outlet for the surplus population and the requirements of industry and commerce, were the love of adventure and enterprise, and the fortune-hunting spirit inborn in many Greeks, and as time went on, not a few were detached from their home countries by the political unrest which attended the evolution of government from monarchy to aristocracy, tyranny, and democracy. Minoan, Etruscan, and Chalcidic colonization. The Minoans had traded with Sicily and with Italy, as far north at least as Campania, and had sent colonists thither. A last remnant most probably was the Etruscan people, whose Minoan ancestors came to Italy no later than 800. Then the mariners of Chalcis followed in the Etruscan path to Campania, for barter with the natives. About 750 they planted their first colony in Italy. The chief object was trade, as we may infer from its location, on the little island of Pithecusae, of the promontory of Misenum. Here the strangers could defend themselves far better than on the mainland. It was a lovely isle with beautiful landscape, rich soil, and an exhaustless supply of the best clay to be found in Italy. From there they crossed over to the mainland and settled Cumae, by ancient repute the oldest Greek colony in the peninsula. Its founding, however, could have been no earlier than the middle of the 8th century. Long afterward Cumae, in conjunction with some Athenians, settled Neapolis on the Bay of Naples. The Cumaeans manufactured vases and metalwares, for trade with the native Ausonians, in whose country they were settled, and with the Latins farther north. Their fields unstintingly yielded grain, with which in after years they could relieve the city of Rome when distressed with famine. Cumaean culture. On the loftiest hill of the city, the Cumaeans built a temple to Apollo, in which they erected a wooden statue no less than 15 feet in height. The shrine was the center of culture, which at that time was all religious. Here the Greeks continued to expand the myths of their race, making Odysseus, Ulysses, and other national heroes visit the shores of Italy in their wanderings. The volcanic character of the land suggested the presence of supernature, the terrific battle of the giants for the ownership of a fertile neighboring plain, the cavernous mouth of Hades' realm, and the mysterious abode of the Sibyl, Apollo's prophetess, who wrote her oracles on leaves. This was the first Hellenic center of culture with which the Romans came in touch. Thence they borrowed the cult of Apollo and the art of writing. Other Chalcidic colonies. Afterward, the Cumaeans, with other colonists from the mother city, founded Zancle, the sickle-shaped town, on the Sicilian side of the Strait of Messina. In later years, after receiving an accession of immigrants from Messenia, it came to be named Messini, Messana. Other Chalcidic towns were Rhegium, on the opposite side of the strait, and Hymera on the northern coast of Sicily, far to the west of Zancle. Achaean colonies. Meanwhile, Achaeans from northern Peloponnese founded Sybaris in the instep of the peninsula. Built in a plain which was unhealthful yet marvelously productive, the town drew abundant wealth from the soil. Her people expanded by colonization and conquest, till, it is said, they ruled over 4 nationalities and 25 cities. In their final struggle with Croton, we are informed with undoubted exaggeration that they placed 300,000 men in the field. A colony on the west coast, founded partly by them, was Posidonia, which now attracts a continual stream of tourists by its temple ruins. In a district malarial and thinly peopled, yet surpassingly fertile, stands the temple to Poseidon, impressive in its lonely majesty. Originally agricultural, the Achaeans developed a great commerce, especially as intermediaries between Ionia and Etruria. Milesian woolens of fine texture, brought to Sybaris, were transported across the peninsula to her coast colonies, where Etruscan merchants eagerly bought them. Croton, another Achaean city, acquired a territory inferior to that of Sybaris, but a superior fame for athleticism and war. Locri, a colony from Locris, remained purely agricultural, hence far inferior in wealth and population to the great Achaean cities. Here arose the first Indo-European law code, which tradition assigns to Zaleucus. Dorian colonies, Tarentum. In Italy, the Dorians made one settlement of primary importance, Tarentum, founded, according to traditions, from Laconia in the time of the Messenian Wars. It was on an excellent harbor in the instep of Italy, northeast of Sybaris. The settlers wrested from the native Iapygians a wide tract of land, in which they occupied themselves with farming and sheep raising. Equally important were fishing and the preparation of purple dye. The Tarentines developed a great industry in weaving and dyeing fine woolens, as well as in vase making. Their wares they exported throughout the peninsula. The Greek colonists, and by no means least among them the Tarentines, profoundly affected the history of Italy. Syracuse, founded 734. Among the earliest colonizers of Sicily were the Corinthians. Archias, a noble sailing from Corinth, left a band of settlers on Corcyra. Thence, proceeding to Sicily, he founded Syracuse on the island of Ortygia. The fountain Arethusa supplied copious fresh water, while the great and little harbors gave certain promise of a splendid commercial future. The colonists divided among themselves the adjacent territory, in large estates to be worked by serfs called Kilirians. We do not know the origin of this class, but evidently the natives, Syces, formed a great part of it. Far more numerous than their lords, they corresponded in status to the Helots of Laconia described below. Thus the society of the colony differentiated into great landlords, a middle class of merchants and artisans, serfs, and purchased slaves. Soon the city outgrew the island and expanded over the neighboring plateau. Under favoring conditions of location and soil, Syracuse was destined, in the days of her greatness, to become the most populous and the most strongly fortified city in Europe. Acragas, Agrigentum, and other colonies in Sicily. Many other Dorian colonies from various cities were planted in southern Sicily, the most brilliant of which was Acragas. Its founders, after long toils bravely borne, took by a river's side a sacred dwelling place, and became the eye of Sicily, and a life of good luck clave to them, to crown their inborn worth. Their citadel was a lofty ridge, 2 miles from the shore. Beneath this shelter on the south, the city grew up on the high ground between 2 mountain streams, which join below before flowing onto the sea. The river's estuary served as a harbor. There the jars of oil and wine produced in the rich fields about the city were loaded for shipment to the eager marts of Carthage, whence a back-returning stream of silver marvelously enriched the Acragantines. Other colonies of Sicily, to be named in the course of this narrative, need not be mentioned here. A wreath of Hellenic settlements nearly encircled the flowery island. Only in the west the Phoenicians, receding somewhat before the aggressive Greeks, stubbornly maintained themselves. Importance of the western Greek colonies. The economic and cultural history of the Italian and Sicilian Greeks is closely twinned on the one hand with that of the mother country, on the other with that of Rome. They interest us not only for their own contributions to civilization and their reactive stimulus to older Hellas, but even more as a mighty factor in the civilization of Italy, and through Italy of Central and Western Europe. Improved navigation and the far western colonies. Spain. The earlier voyages to these shores had been made in small round-bottomed boats described above. In the 7th century developed a somewhat longer vessel, with flatter bottom, furnished with 50 oars, and armed with a bronze beak for attack. These improved ships conveyed the Samians, and more actively the Phocaeans, in their distant voyages to Iberia, Spain, whose gold, silver, and copper attracted them. Beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the stormy Atlantic, the Cassiterides Isles and distant Britain yielded tin, a metal chiefly prized as an ingredient of bronze. In the tin trade, the Phoenicians were intermediaries between Greeks and natives. Colonies in Gaul. On the southern coast of Gaul, Phocians founded Massalia, Marseille, long the chief center of Hellenic culture in the western Mediterranean, mother of a cluster of colonies in Gaul and Iberia, and school of the neighboring barbarians who learned there to speak and write the Hellenic tongue. The Greeks of this region brought with them the Ionian laws, and from Ephesus the cult of Artemis, whose temples rose in every city. We must accordingly regard the Phocians as the forerunners of Rome in the work of civilizing southwestern Europe, northern Aegean colonies. A somewhat different interest attaches to colonial movements in other directions. The founding of settlements on the Thracian Sea and along the Hellespont and Propontis served merely to expand Aegean Hellas to its natural limits. In the occupation of the Chalcidic Peninsula, the name itself suggests that Chalcis took the lead, though Eritrea and Corinth participated. The country was rough, but the chief occupation was agriculture along with fishing. In later time, the timber of the region proved a source of revenue, and in the neighborhood were the mines of Mount Pangaeus. It was through these colonies that the Macedonians of the interior, a backward Hellenic people, slowly acquired the civilization of their progressive southern kinsmen. Colonies on the Hellespont and Propontis. Meanwhile, the Ionians were sailing through the Hellespont and the Propontis and along the coasts of the Black Sea to catch the tunny fish, to trade with the natives, and to plant settlements on all the shores. Miletus alone is said to have founded no less than 90 in this region. Most important, however, was Byzantium on the Propontis, the most famous among the colonies of Megara. It is situated on a spacious bay in touch with migrating shoals of fish, an exhaustless source of wealth to the inhabitants. Their command of the strait enabled them to levy tolls on passing ships, while splendid opportunities for commerce, combined with a strong defensible position, further contributed to their prosperity. 1,000 years after its founding, this city, under the name of Constantinople, became the capital of the Roman Empire. Colonies on the Black Sea. Although Hellenic settlements surrounded the Black Sea in a nearly unbroken chain, their civilization failed to penetrate far into the interior or materially to affect the natives. For such results, the settlers were all too few. To Hellas, the Black Sea region, while offering little intellectual aid, furnished useful products, especially fish, timber, dyes, wheat, metals, cattle, and slaves. Naucratis, Egypt. In another direction, Greek enterprise was to bear rich intellectual fruit. About the middle of the 7th century, Psammetichus had made himself master of Egypt, with the help of bronze-clad Ionian and Carian rovers of the sea. He and his dynasty were therefore most friendly to the Greeks. A settlement of Ionian traders on the Canobic channel of the Nile, they permitted accordingly to grow till it became the colony of Naucratis. Here, under the protection of the government, various Greek cities of Asia Minor, and the neighboring islands, together with Aegina, established their warehouse for trade. The king enlisted many Greek mercenaries. The natives, whose country produced few grapes, enjoyed the wines imported from Greece, and sent in exchange the varied products of the Orient. A class of native interpreters acquainted with the Hellenic tongue grew up, who entranced the curious tourist with wondrous tales of folklore and religion and medical skill, of engineering and building achievement, in the erection of pyramid or labyrinth or temple, whose immensity and durability awed the impressionable Hellenic mind. The importation of papyrus into Greece cheapened writing material, while the elementary facts of geometry and astronomy, brought home by inquisitive tourists, stimulated the birth of Hellenic science and philosophy. To the opening of Egypt, therefore, we may trace in part the great intellectual awakening of Hellas. Motive and effects of colonization. It is unnecessary in these pages to mention by name any one of the hundreds of other Greek settlements scattered along the coasts of the Mediterranean and of its tributary waters. The leading motive, as has been noticed, was economic, expansion of trade, and provision for the surplus population of a marvelously virile race. Among the effects were not only the bestowal of Hellenism in a varying degree upon the peoples of the Mediterranean basin, but also the enrichment of the Greeks themselves, and, through contact with the world, their own stupendous advance in civilization. All that the Europeans and their colonists now are in the world, the Hellenes were then in the Mediterranean basin, carriers of civilization and reapers of political and economic profit through their vital and intellectual mastery. The founding and the organization of a colony. In the planting of colonies, the Greeks of this period gradually developed a body of customs to which they felt morally bound. The founding city, metropolis, mother state, after obtaining the sanction of the Delphic Apollo, appointed as founder a citizen of noble family to conduct the colonists to their new home, establish the government, and after death receive worship as a hero. Often an invitation was issued to friendly neighbors to take part. A charter of incorporation was drawn up, which constituted the proposed settlement as a community, named the founder, provided for the assignment of lands and for other necessary matters, and regulated the relations between the mother and daughter cities. The tie was fundamentally one of kinship, such as binds parents and children. Well, I know that many colonies have been and will be at enmity with their parents, but in early days the child, as in a family, loves and is loved. Even if there come a time later when the tie is broken, still, while he is in want of education, he naturally loves his parents and is beloved by them, and flies to his relatives for protection, and finds in them his only natural allies in the time of need. These words of Plato testify to the strong bond of filial sentiment which showed itself in the participation in common religious festivals, in the reciprocal rights and honors extended by each community to the member of the other, and in the general continuity of religious, social, and political usages and institutions of the old city in the new. a colony in the neighborhood of the mother state, usually remained politically dependent, such as were the Athenian settlements of the 5th century, known as kleroukies, lot holdings, but so strong were the decentralizing tendencies that distant colonies became forthwith sovereign states, permanently united with the mother state, however, by the firmest bond of alliance known to the Greeks. The colonial movement tended accordingly to widen the sympathy beyond the narrow limits of city-state, while the experience gained in the framing of charters and in the organization of new communities stimulated the development of written law and constitutions, and ultimately the birth of political science. Commerce was greatly promoted by the invention of coinage. Early in the Middle Age, the Minoan currency was lost to the world, which in consequence returned to barter. After the introduction of iron, spits, obols of that metal passed as small currency. In the 8th century, the Ionians, reviving the Minoan custom, began to use as coins striated drops of electron, a natural amalgam of gold and silver. Probably they were before the Lydians in the adoption of a coinage. From the early 7th century, Ionian and Lydian issues may be approximately dated. West of the Aegean Sea, the Aeginetans were the first to stamp coins. Their type was a 2-drachma piece of about 194 grains, giving 97 grains to the drachma. The latter, considered equivalent to 6 current obols, would furnish silver for an American $0.25. This double drachma was called a tertis, from the figure of that reptile stamped on the face. It passed current not only in Aegina, but also for a long time in the Greek peninsula, on many of the islands, and in Hellenic colonies of Italy and Sicily. Chalkis and Eritrea were not far behind Aegina in coinage. Among their earliest issues were various denominations in electron. Their standard coin, however, was a silver piece, weighing about 135 grains, and therefore much lighter than the Aeginetan. Attic chronicles of later time regarded this piece too as a double drachma. It passed current in the numerous Euboeic colonies and was adopted by Solon as a standard for Athens. The silver contained in this drachma is worth in American money a trifle more than 18 cents. End of section 4. Chapter 5. Evolution of City-State, Amphictyones and Leagues. Economic and political transition from Minoan to Hellenic times. Limiting itself narrowly to islands and coasts, the Minoan civilization owed its evolution to the interplay of commercial and industrial cities. Its decay consisted largely in the breaking down of the highly organized life of the city, and a reversion to the simpler forms of existence native to field and mountain. The coming of the Northerners, accustomed to nothing better than the village, accentuated this change. The economy of the Middle Age, accordingly, was one of hunting, grazing, and incipient agriculture. The emergence of historical Greece, on the other hand, from the obscurity and depression of that period, consisted essentially in the revival of city civilization, based partly on the old seats of Minoan life and partly on newer foundations. It has already been noted that the area of the Minoan culture mainly the Aegean islands and coasts, now becoming the home of brilliant cities, constituted the very heart of the Hellenic world. The ethnos, the interior and northwest of the peninsula, keeping in the background of culture, retained the more primitive form of the country-state. This institution is designated as an ethnos, essentially a community resting on the basis of blood, and negatively described as wanting the city organization. Such a people occupied a definite territory, usually limited by natural boundaries as mountain chains or seas, and was distinguished from other ethni by dialect and customs. Examples are the Aetolians, Acarnanians, Locrians, and Arcadians. A large ethnos like the Aetolians comprised several sub-ethni which we may venture to call tribes. The latter were divided into smaller groups, the subdivision continuing till we reach the phratry, brotherhood, and its component families. The members of a phratry as kinsmen stood side by side on the field of battle, and in time of peace protected the lives of the brethren, or wreaked vengeance for their slain. Each group from phratry upward, based on real or pretended kinship, had its social institutions, government and gods. But of these matters the ancient historians give us mere hints. The village, comi, the canton, systema, the city-state, polis. The people lived in small, widely separated villages, most of them unwalled. Though the village naturally contained a nucleus of kinsfolk, it was fundamentally territorial, comprising a mixed population, and served accordingly as the first step in the transition from tribal to political society. Neighboring villages, with little respect for the ties of kin, joined for mutual protection in a canton, which usually centered in a fortified hilltop. The village chief, demiurgos, public worker, represented his community in the cantonal diet. Several such Arcadian cantons continued down into historical time. Under conditions favorable to the advancement of civilization, to the accumulation of wealth, and to political development, the cantonal center became a city, polis. Throughout the historical period, we constantly observe the formation of cities from villages, and cannot doubt that in prehistoric Greece the process was similar. Although the city thus developed on the basis of neighborhood rather than of blood, it organized itself on the ethnic patterns in tribes, or their equivalents, and phratries, and assumed for its citizens a kinship which was fictitious. The new city was a sovereign state, whose organization and government sufficed for her entire territory. A community of this kind is described as a city-state, in contrast with a more primitive ethnic community, and with the territorial state of modern times. At the opening of the period now under consideration, there were in Hellas, in addition to many ethni, a countless number of these states, ranging from a few square miles to a few hundred square miles in area. Monarchy. Whether of ethnos or polis, the government was originally vested in king, council, and popular assembly. Though essentially like that described by Homer, Minoan survivals in many places must have modified it in the direction of greater definiteness and complexity. Its activity, however, was limited to defense against foreign enemies and domestic rebellion. maintenance of the god's goodwill, and the arbitration of private disputes. The defense of life itself, as has been intimated, belonged to the families and phratries. Law was in fact customary, but the general feeling prevailed that the king, who ruled by divine sanction, received his judgments from Zeus or Apollo or some other deity. Transition to aristocracy, beginning about 750. In some ethni, as in Epirus and Macedon, monarchy persisted throughout historical times. The more progressive city-state, however, as the Ionian, began to adopt aristocracies about the middle of the 8th century. The change was gradual. The great nobles who formed the council took an ever-increasing part in the government till they usurped complete control. Their means of aggrandizement were the degradation of the king to a mere priest and judge, the institution of new offices in addition to the kingship, the reduction of the tenure of all offices to a single year, and the appointment and supervision of officials, rendering them responsible to the council for their administration. In this way, the council made itself supreme, while the officers became its tools, and the assembly lost the little significance it had possessed under the monarchy. Law. The idea of law underwent a corresponding change. While it remained for a time purely customary as before, the nobles generally regarded themselves not as recipients of legal revelations, but as keepers of a body of law once divinely established and now handed down as a precious heritage from father to son. The nobles made use of their legal monopoly to decide cases capriciously, or from motives of favoritism, or in pursuit of bribes. Persuaded by their love of money, exclaims Solon of Athens, the nobles desire recklessly to destroy the great city. As to the people, the mind of their magistrates is dishonest. Magistrates who are doomed to suffer many ills because of their monstrous violence. They grow wealthy in obedience to unjust deeds. Codifications of the law. Zaleucus. These evils, it was doubtless thought, could be partially remedied by the codification of legal usages. The state already possessed some written documents, including lists of magistrates and treaties, and it was but natural that writing should now be extended to the preservation of laws. The earliest European code known to history was produced at Locri, Italy. The story is told that, on consulting the oracle in a time of civil confusion, the Locrians were directed to a slave shepherd named Zaleucus. Set free and established as legislator, he drew up a code of laws which he explained were given him by Athena in dreams. He carefully regulated the lives of the citizens, and imposed the stigma of a depraved character on women and men who indulged in an excess of liberty or luxury of dress or ornament. He placed property and business contracts under better control, and deprived the judge of the power to give arbitrary decisions. Ordinances concerning personal injuries were severe, requiring an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In a case of appeal, we are informed, judge and appealant had each other to appear with his neck in a noose, and the one who failed to sustain his cause was executed on the spot. In like manner, the proposer of a new law was required to advocate it with a noose about his neck. The result was that the Locrians became famous for conservatism, military spirit, hospitality, and sound morals. There at Locri, says Pindar, do ye, O Muses, join in the song of triumph. I pledge my word that to no stranger banishing folk ye shall come, nor unacquainted with things noble, but of the highest in the arts and valiant with a spear. With the Muses setting myself thereunto fervently, have I embraced the Locrians' famous race, and have sprinkled my honey over a city of goodly men. The laws of Zaleucus will suffice as an illustration of early codes. Those of Athens will be considered in another place. From aristocracy to tyranny. In Thessaly, the aristocrats who had wrested the supreme power from the king long retained their supremacy. Elsewhere, they were usually too weak to endure more than a century or thereabout. Often the aristocracy was overthrown by a tyrant, usurper, unconstitutional ruler. It is noteworthy that among the Greek states of the 7th century, Lacedaemon alone, so far as we know, possessed a standing army sufficient for maintaining domestic peace and protecting life and property. The rest were filled with civil strife. This condition made the usurpation of government easy. Sometimes a magistrate refused to lay down his office on its expiration, but maintained himself by force. In this way he became a tyrant. Or the tyrant might be an umpire, whom warring factions chose to arbitrate between them, and who took advantage of the occasion to seize the government. More commonly, he was an ambitious politician, who, failing in a struggle for office, appealed to the people, promising them economic or political advantage in return for their support. A military reputation, added to smoothness of speech, increases chances for success. With the help of the commons, he would overthrow his fellow aristocrats, and make himself master. Tyranny at Corinth, 657 to 586. Conventional though uncertain dates. Among the earliest tyrannies was that of the Kypselidae at Corinth. Kypselus, the founder, overthrew the ruling Bacchiadae, to whom he was related on his mother's side. During his reign of 30 years, he drove many Corinthians into exile. Many he deprived of their wealth, and very many more of their lives. These words of Herodotus should apply only to his treatment of the nobles. By the people he was so beloved throughout his reign as to require no personal guard. The Bacchiad policy of colonization and patronage of the useful and fine arts he inherited and handed down to his son and successor, Periander. Periander. Of the latter, Herodotus has still more discreditable stories to tell. Elsewhere, however, we learn that he was an able commander in war, and a wise and moderate ruler. By checking the importation of slaves, he assured to skilled workmen a better social standing than this class enjoyed anywhere else in Hellas. To encourage agriculture as well as political quiet, he forbade unoccupied persons to live within the city. A council which he established was charged with the duty of checking the growth of luxury and of seeing that no one spent more than his income warranted. As market and harbor customs sufficed for the needs of government, the citizens were relieved of direct taxes. These statesmanlike measures help account for his long reign of 44 years. The tyranny survived him but 3 years, when it was overthrown by a band of conspirators. Tyranny at Sicyon, 670 to 560. Conventional, though uncertain dates. Next in brilliance among the early Hellenic tyrants stood the Orthagoride of Sicyon. This city lay northwest of Corinth, in the narrow but fertile valley of the Esopus. The little district was as famous for its garden and orchard products as for bronze wares and potteries. In addition to landlords and their serfs, there had developed a considerable class of artisans and traders. Whereas usually the tyrant was of noble birth, Orthagoras, who usurped the government of Sicyon, was from a lower social class. Clisthenes, early 6th century. Of his descendants, it was Clisthenes who made his city one of the most brilliant in Hellas. His first effort was to free Sicyon from the political control which Argos hitherto had exercised over it. This object he accomplished in a successful war with a dominant power. Moreover, he forbade the rhapsodists to chant in Sicyon their epics, which celebrated the glories of Argos. To free his countrymen from religious dependence on their former master, he determined to expel from his city the cult of Adrastus, an Argive hero. With this end in view, he built a shrine to the Theban hero Melanippus, who in story had figured as a deadly enemy of Adrastus. To the newly adopted hero he transferred all the revenues and festivals of the old, whereupon the priests of Adrastus beat a hasty retreat from Sicyon. This anecdote illustrates the singular importance of hero cults among the early Greeks. The three Doric tribes, to which the landowners belonged, still reminded Sicyon of its close connection with Argos, till Clisthenes abolished their names, contemptuously substituting piglings, donkeys, and porkers. Whereas his own tribe of shoremen, evidently comprising artisans and traders, he dignified by the name of ruling class, Archelae. This measure hints at a policy which transformed Sicyon from an agricultural to an industrial and commercial state. The wooing of Agariste. Another picture of this illustrious tyrant, drawn by Herodotus, shows him a lordly, generous host. On his invitation came young men of noblest birth from every part of Hellas to woo his daughter Agariste, and for a whole year he entertained them, while he tested their athletic and musical training, their social and table manners, their breeding and temper. He looked with favor on Hippocleides of Athens, till the latter one evening displayed a marvelous skill in dancing. After representing Laconian figures and then Attic, he closed with a performance on the table head downward, his feet gesticulating in air. "Ah, son of Tisander," exclaimed the sovereign, "thou hast danced away thy wedding." The other answered, "Hippocleides cares not," which became a proverb at Athens. In a polite address Clisthenes then expressed his regret at not having a daughter to bestow on every one of his highly accomplished guests, and promising them a silver talent each as a trifling substitute, he concluded, "To the son of Alcmaeon, Megacles, I offer my daughter Agariste in marriage, according to the laws of the Athenians." The offer was accepted, and the two who were thus united became the parents of the famous Athenian lawgiver Clisthenes, and the great-grandparents of the still more famous Pericles. This story sheds a pleasant light on the social relations and intermarriage of the great nobles of Greece, on the genial elegance of the tyrant, and on his wide interstate connections. The death of Clisthenes about 570 closed the century-long rule of his dynasty. Evidently other tyrants succeeded, and it was not till near the end of the 6th century, about 510, that Sicyon shook off the yoke. In the case of both Corinth and Sicyon, the revolution was accomplished by a band of noble conspirators, supported by the Lacedaemonians. Both cities adopted moderate oligarchy, and both entered the Peloponnesian League. General character of the tyranny. These examples sufficiently illustrate, for the present purpose, the character of the earlier tyranny. Whatever the tyrant's origin, his authority was generally exercised in the interest of peace, material prosperity, and progress in civilization. Putting an end alike to the factional strife of nobles and the sectional conflicts of tribes, he reduced his people to harmony and established domestic peace. No force in the Hellenic world of the time contributed so much to cultural progress. The tyrant's patronage attracted poets, painters, sculptors, and architects, who formed in his court a brilliant and versatile society. Everywhere, excepting in Sicyon, rhapsodists were engaged to recite the Homeric poems at popular gatherings, and everywhere at festivals in honor of the new god, Dionysus, song and recitation, the germ of the drama, celebrated the sufferings and joys he experienced among mankind. By thus fostering literary interest among the people, and by attaching them to newer cults, he freed them in a degree from the priestly influence of the old nobility, and educated them for self-government, redress of legal and political wrongs. The tyrant's promise to the commons he fulfilled by putting an end to aristocratic oppression, to the exactions of landlords, and to the unjust sentences of magistrates. Generally, he enforced the existing laws and constitution, though he was far from permitting the people to enjoy any real political power. The leveling of social classes, the enforcement of law by mercenary aid, developing a much-needed civic discipline, together with an enlightened educational policy, constituted an essential and long-reaching stride on the way from aristocracy to democracy. Necessarily, however, as the tyrant concentrated governmental power in his own hands, the political rights of the citizens slept, while individuals of pronounced ambition were exiled or put to death. The long continuance of despotism would have crushed the genius of the Greeks and reduced them to the dead level of Asiatics. Fortunately, tyrannies were short-lived. Whereas the usurper himself was a statesman, his sons, and even more his grandsons, corrupted by wealth and unlimited power, so degenerated as to give the word tyrant the meaning which it had retained to the present time. Almost inevitably, however, the tyranny was succeeded either by a democracy or by an oligarchy, more liberally constituted than the earlier aristocracy. Oligarchy. Literally, an oligarchy is a rule of the few. According to Aristotle, the few who base their right upon wealth. The narrowest and most oppressive form arose where a clique of wealthy men seized the government and exploited the state in their own interest. It is characterized by Aristotle as dynastic, a hydra-headed tyranny, far more heartless than the despotism of an individual. Broader and more endurable was the knightly oligarchy, in which participation in the government depended upon economic ability to furnish all necessary equipments for service on horseback. The knight provided from his own estate either a single horse or 2 horses, one for himself, the other for his squire. Chalkis and Eretria are examples. This form of oligarchy, in which political privileges are graded on the basis of property, is precisely described as a timocracy of the heavy infantry. A more popular form was so broad as to admit to active citizenship all who could equip themselves with a panoply for war. The latter developed from the former, mainly through the growth of states in population and wealth. The earliest government which existed among the Hellenes, after the overthrow of the kingly power, grew up from the warrior class, and was originally taken from the knights, for strength and superiority in war at that time depended on cavalry. Indeed, without discipline, infantry are useless, and in ancient times there was no military knowledge or tactics, and therefore the strength of armies lay in their cavalry. But when cities increased and the heavy armed grew in strength, more had a share in the government. The best known example is that of Athens immediately before Solon. A timocracy of the heavy infantry may expand, either directly or through the tyranny, to democracy. The latter kind of government will be treated in connection with the reforms of Clisthenes at Athens. Political versatility of the Hellenes. By means of typical instances, we have now traced the main lines of development from monarchy to the beginning of democracy. For appreciating the genius of the Greeks, however, we must bear in mind that in the creation of forms of government they showed the same boundless versatility as in the fields of literature, art, and philosophy. Among their most precious contributions to civilization is the republican government, which they devised in endless variety, and which assured to the citizens a varying degree of liberty and self-government. In this atmosphere of freedom they created political science, as represented by the works of Plato and Aristotle. We must not condemn these efforts because in some or all respects they fall short of the actualities or ideals of today. But in all fairness we must regard the Greeks as pioneers, whose political strivings, necessarily tentative, have furnished to after ages suggestions and inspirations for a more perfectly balanced democracy. Combinations of states. The motive which first led neighboring states, whether ethni or cities, to combine in leagues, lies far anterior to recorded history. It might have been a border market, the need of allies, the desire for frontier security, or a nascent consciousness of kindred blood. Whatever may have been the practical impetus to friendly intercourse, such neighboring states chose the sanctuary of a deity conveniently situated, at which to hold a periodical festival for worship, often too a fair for the interchange of goods. A union of neighbors ostensibly for a religious object, but sometimes serving more practical ends, was termed an amphictyony. That of Delos, centering in the shrine of Apollo on that island, reached the height of its splendor, probably early in the 7th century. The Homeric hymn to the Delian Apollo, composed at that time, celebrates the gathering of the Ionians, with their wives and children, to worship this god, with music, dancing, and gymnastic exercises, and to trade. From an original union of insular neighbors, it had come to include all the Ionians. Without ever assuming a political character, it eventually declined. Another amphictyony comprised 12 ethni in the neighborhood of Thermopylae. Its earliest seat of worship was the shrine of Demeter at Anthela, near that pass, but in time it acquired a second and more important center, in the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Hence it came to be known as the Delphic amphictyony. The object of the league was the protection of the shrines, especially of the temple and oracle of Apollo. The government lay in the hands of an amphictyonic council, comprising 48 speakers, 4 from each tribe, and 12 recorders. The speakers alone proposed and debated measures. The recorders alone voted. A resolution adopted by this council in the immemorial past imposed an oath upon the members of the league not to destroy an amphictyonic city or to cut it off from running water in war or peace. Here was one of the earliest attempts to mitigate the primitive rigors of war. Many other decrees of the council are known to us, including one which forbade the Greeks to levy tolls on pilgrims to the shrine, and another requiring the states of the league to keep in repair their own roads leading to Delphi. Against the state which trespassed upon any rights of the god, it had the power to declare a sacred war. Although the council sometimes championed the cause of Hellas, as could any association or individual, it never acquired a recognized authority over all the Greeks, and notwithstanding its occasional participation in political affairs, it remained essentially a religious convocation. Hegemony. A union religious at basis tended to become political, especially when it contained a state of superior power and secular ambition. For example, the Boeotian amphictyony, whose deities were Poseidon and Athena, was converted into a federal union by Thebes. Its constitution, which developed toward the end of the 5th century, grouped the states of the league in 11 units, roughly equal in population. These units were equally represented in the federal magistracy, council and court, and had equal military and financial burdens. It provided further for a referendum of important matters to the states, and seems to have admitted of an initiative from the states. Theoretically, the arrangement was most admirable, but in fact the Thebans, who constituted 4 of the 11 units of representation, dominated the federal policy. These examples will suffice for illustrating the amphictyony and the earlier experimentation with political unions of states. Other confederations will be mentioned in the course of this narrative. The brilliancy of the Greek mind is devising systems of combination, however, was for a long time more than offset by the excessive individualism of small republics, to whom sovereign independence was the breath of life. End of chapter 5.